This story happened a few years ago. I would often go to Starbucks to get work done on my laptop. It was my favorite place to work because I liked their coffee, and I didn't have the distractions I would have at home, so I could get a lot more work done. One day in the winter, I was working like I often did. It was nighttime, probably about 7:30 or so. The Starbucks I liked to go to closed at 8:30, so it was pretty calm and not really anybody else was there other than me at the time. I sat in my favorite spot, which was in the back corner at a table with this one soft chair that they had. I had to go to the bathroom, so I got up and walked over to it, which was only about 10 feet away from where I sat. I was in the bathroom for maybe a minute or two, and then came back out and returned to my laptop. I went back to work until I realized something. There was a portable USB stick that was in my computer. I knew it wasn't mine, and it hadn't been there before. I took it out and looked around the coffee shop. There was nobody else in there besides me. I got up and walked around, and then went to the counter and brought the USB with me. I asked someone working there if they had seen anyone go to my computer and handed them the USB drive. I was told they hadn't seen anyone, but they took the USB to hold on to. I looked from the counter and could see that the area I had been sitting in was obscured from the vision of whoever was working. I went back and got my laptop and then left. I was hoping that whatever that was a joke, and they didn't mess up my computer in any way. When I got home, I looked on my computer again, and noticed that there was a new folder on the bottom left side of my screen. It was titled with just a bunch of numbers, and I clicked on it to see a text document. When I opened it up, a message read, "Hello, I know everything about you, where you live, who you are, and what you're doing." It really creeped me out, and I closed and deleted the file. Could this be true? Did the USB stick on my computer somehow reveal all of my information? I was terrified. As I was on my computer, suddenly something popped up on my screen. It was a video of myself on my webcam in a window. I tried to close the window, but I couldn't. No matter how many times I clicked or what I did, it just stayed there on my screen. It was the creepiest thing ever, so I slammed my laptop shut. I didn't use it again for a long time after that, and ended up taking it to a professional to have it cleared and reset. Looking back at that experience, I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm afraid whoever did that to me knew where I lived. I used to go to Starbucks all the time. I would say at least 2 or 3 times a week I would stop at Starbucks for coffee on my way to work. I would order online every time as I left my house, and then pick it up on my way. I got it so often that some of the employees started to recognize me, and I would be friendly with a few of them. Sadly though, the lines at the location I usually went to were always super long, and one day I realized another Starbucks that was also on my way to work. I made the choice to switch locations to see if it would be faster, and it was in fact quite a bit faster every single day, and it saved me some time. After I would say about a couple of weeks of going to the new location, one day I forgot to place my order online. It wasn't a big deal, but I would just have to order at the drive-thru at the Starbucks. When I got there, the voice on the other end of the speaker of the drive-thru said hi to me and called me by my name. This surprised me because I had only been to that location 3 or 4 times at that point, and it wasn't a daily basis or anything. I also didn't recognize the voice as it was a man's voice, and all the people I knew from the previous location were females. I pulled up to the next window after I ordered, and a man with a headset came to the window. I paid and he handed me my coffee and smiled. He once again said my name and told me to have a nice day, then he winked at me. The man was rather tall and had sort of long dark hair with a slight beard. I have to say I had never seen him before, but beyond that I really didn't think anything of it. It wasn't until every single time that I would go to Starbucks after that, he would be working and would always be the one to hand me my order. Each time he would wink at me or have an almost creepy grin on his face. None of this really bothered me though, but it did feel a little bit strange. Then I stopped seeing the man. There were different people every time when I got my coffee in the morning, and I didn't really notice the fact that I wasn't seeing this strange guy anymore. One of the times I went inside to pick up my coffee and was walking back to my car when suddenly I saw the man again. He was in the parking lot and he approached me as I was getting into my car. I didn't really recognize him at first. It took me a few seconds. He said hi to me and smiled and asked me how I was doing. I said fine in a confused tone and asked what he wanted. He then asked me how the movie I watched last night was. Then he winked at me like the past times and walked away. I stood there next to my car in shock. I had in fact been watching a movie the previous night, but I had no idea how he knew about it. I was really creeped out, and for me, this was the last straw with the man from being slightly weird to completely creepy. I had no idea who this guy was other than the fact that he worked at the Starbucks and was creepy. I decided to go back inside the Starbucks and ask another employee who he was. I first looked around the parking lot, but the man was gone. I then walked inside the Starbucks, which was relatively busy, but nothing too crazy. I went to the counter and asked who the man was with longer brown hair, a slight beard, and pretty tall. I was told in response that it sounded a lot like a guy named Jonathan, who had worked there but had been fired for inappropriate behavior around the workplace. They said he had worked at another location close by, but had moved to that location shortly before getting fired. I briefly told my story. I was told by several people that they thought he seemed creepy and had apparently followed one of his coworkers home one night. It gave me the chills as I realized this Jonathan guy most likely was outside of my house the previous night and saw me watching a movie. So many thoughts started to race through my head, such as how did he know where I lived, and had he followed me home or been to my house before? I had to go to work at that point, so I left, but throughout the day I texted with several of my friends about what had happened. Later that day I got home from work and asked my friend Lisa to come over and keep me company. I got home and shortly after heard the sound of Lisa pulling up. I was so relieved because I really didn't want to be alone in my house that night after what had happened. But then I received a text from Lisa saying that she would be there in about 15 minutes. I went over to look out the window and noticed a different car driving slowly down the street outside my window. I lived in a quiet neighborhood and there wasn't a whole lot of cars that went down the street, so I sort of noticed when they did. It was a black car and the windows were tinted. It parked across the street, but slightly past my house. Of course, I was paranoid and worried that it was the Jonathan guy. I watched the car from my window, hoping to see anybody get out of the car that wasn't Jonathan from Starbucks. But nobody was getting out. Then my phone started to vibrate and ring in my left hand as I held the living room curtain open with my right. It just about gave me a heart attack, and I closed the curtain and looked at who was calling me. It was a number that I didn't recognize. I decided to answer it. The voice on the other end was the familiar voice of Jonathan. I heard him ask me why I was watching him and told me to come outside. I freaked out at this and screamed as loud as I could that I was calling the police. He then hung up on me and I opened the curtain slightly to see his car pulling away. I then called the police and they said they would be on their way. They arrived a short time later along with Lisa. I gave them as much information as I could on Jonathan and I stayed at Lisa's house the next few nights. Finally, I was told that Jonathan had been found and I would no longer have to worry about him anymore. He had worked at the first Starbucks I had been to almost every day and apparently asked to transfer when he realized I had gone to another one. I just wonder how long he knew where I lived or how many times he had been to my house without me noticing. Last year, I went to Starbucks for some coffee. I don't get Starbucks all that often, but I do from time to time. On this particular day, I was pretty sleepy but had to drive about an hour home, so I went for some coffee. It wasn't all that busy there, but there were a few other cars in the drive-thru ahead of me. I pulled in and waited. Eventually it was my turn, and I ordered. When I got to the window to pay, I was told that my order had been paid for by the person in front of me. I wasn't asked if I wanted to keep it going and pay for the next person, but was just handed my coffee. I was pretty happy about it until I drove away and noticed that within the little cardboard thing that goes around the cup, there was a piece of paper rolled up into a note. Obviously I was driving, so I didn't bother reading the note, but once I got home almost an hour later, I read it. It was a small piece of paper which gave details about me and my family, such as names, addresses, and phone numbers. I was told that I needed to come up with $10,000 or something very bad would happen. I couldn't believe what I was reading or how this happened. I had never been to that Starbucks location before and didn't even remember what car had been in front of me to pay for my drink or anything like that. But I was terrified, so I went straight to the police. When I did, I was told they would investigate, and they told me a short time later that they didn't believe I had anything to really worry about. Still, I did worry about it, and I never did consider giving whoever it was the money. I didn't even know how to contact them. It's been a while since that happened now, and I guess maybe it was a joke or something, but I still don't know how to explain any of that, like how the person got my information, or why they chose me in the drive-thru that day.
This happened during my freshman year of high school. Winter had just ended, so the air at night felt really cool, but not too cold. My old best friend, who we'll call Veronica, had texted me asking what I was up to, and she said she was hungry, to which I replied, me too. In order to better understand the story, I should explain the layout and distances from each location. I was at my cousin's house, which was about 8 blocks away from Veronica's, and McDonald's was probably about a half a mile away from both of our homes. Across the street from our McDonald's was a Target and various other fast food chains, and maybe about a mile and a half away was a Burger King. I don't exactly remember whose genius idea it was to sneak out at 11 o'clock at night in order to satisfy our hunger, but nonetheless we did. Although I had never done it before, sneaking out was relatively easy for me. As for Veronica, well, let's just say she wasn't new to it. Because it was late, I was in my PJs, which consisted of shorts and an oversized football jersey. In retrospect, probably not the best clothing idea for 11 p.m. while sneaking out at a not-so-safe city, but I digress. We met up halfway and made our way to McDonald's, catching up about whatever boy problems an idiotic math teacher we had at the time. The streets weren't desolate, but not necessarily bustling with cars either. I remember being worried that my mom would see me walking around at 11 p.m. if she drove by. We decided to cut through Target's huge parking lot to save some distance and time. Now, the McDonald's and Target were a bit uphill, but only if you walked from west to east. We came from south to north, so it wasn't really a problem for us. Not that it would have been either way, but it's better to explain. As we were crossing the street from Target to McDonald's, we saw a guy, probably about 5'5", so he was pretty short. He was wearing a blue hoodie and I believe some shorts. Veronica was maybe about 5'2" at the time, where I was about 5'3" to 5'4". Because all this happened years ago, some of the details are a little fuzzy. I didn't really think too much of the guy because Veronica and I were laughing away and talking about anything and everything, but I did take a mental note of him. So, being the geniuses that we were, neither of us actually checked to see if the McDonald's would be open. Well, to be correct, it was open, but just the drive-thru. Yeah, we failed to do one simple yet very important necessity. No problem for us geniuses though. Why, you may ask? Because Burger King wasn't that far away and we really needed to satisfy our hunger, so why not? We started making our way west, going downhill. I was ranting away while Veronica kept glancing over her shoulder. She has this habit of doing this every time we walk anywhere, no matter the time of day. She then linked her arm around mine and then softly said to me, "That guy is following us." I glanced behind, not making it obvious, but just to see if she was messing with me. Yeah, we kind of had a messed up sense of humor, so it wouldn't have been that much of a stretch. Unfortunately, she was telling the truth. She started to walk faster now, to which I tightened my grip around her arm and told her not to walk so fast or he would know we were on to him. As I mentioned previously, our city wasn't really one of the safest, so I grew up being taught to always be aware of my surroundings. I wasn't as street smart as my siblings, as I was more book smart than anything, but I wasn't a blithering idiot either. I then told Veronica that we should just go across the street and enter Target. As we crossed the street, I glanced behind us and I noticed that he was crossing too. At this point, Veronica was getting extremely worried. And me, you might ask? I was laughing. For some reason I found this to be funny because what are the odds that the first time I ever sneak out, I'd end up being followed from a McDonald's? Suffice to say though, I ended up sneaking out again after that. What can I say? I wanted to get the whole high school experience. As we made our way through the large Target parking lot, I FaceTimed my cousin to share what was currently happening, as she knew I snuck out. While I was laughing and explaining, Veronica was pretty much in full-on panic mode. Eventually I hung up abruptly as Veronica and I decided to run through the rest of the parking lot and right into Target's doors. The guy, still following us. As we made it inside the Target, we decided to walk around just in case he followed us inside, but luckily he didn't. We made our way back to the glass windows where the entrance was located at, and then we sat down to really grasp the whole situation. Veronica said she saw the guy walk past Target in the same direction we had originally came from. Behind Target is a park, which I always walk past in order to get home. I decided to call my older brother and asked what to do. He told me to call my cousin and then tell her to walk and then meet us at Target. I texted her instead, and I told her to bring her giant of a boyfriend who happened to be spending the night. She said that she would meet us by the front. Veronica was really relieved, but I still didn't really care about it at all. A few minutes pass, and a guy walks in Target and makes his way over to Veronica and me. I don't remember exactly, but I think he was Caucasian and maybe about 5'7". He explained that he was in the McDonald's drive-thru when he noticed us walk away, and the guy following from behind. He said that he saw us cross over into Target as well as the guy, and that he wanted to make sure we were safe. We explained our side of the story and then reassured him that we were in fact okay. He told us we shouldn't be out this late and that we should really call our family to pick us up. We said that we had family on the way and then thanked him for looking out for us, to which he told us to stay safe. I think hearing him witness the whole thing really made it feel real to me, because that's kind of when reality hit me. My cousin ended up coming with her boyfriend and dad in the car, so yeah, we got busted. But I didn't get in trouble because, well, they were my cousins, and I was kind of a goody two-shoes. Not to mention the fact that my mom probably would have been really mad at my cousins for not noticing I snuck out under their supervision. Veronica came to my cousin's house with me, where we just talked about what happened. I even FaceTimed one of our senior friends and told him about it too. Veronica and I no longer talk due to other reasons that didn't happen until years later. But during the rest of our friendship, we'd always recount that story and laugh about it. But it really is scary how easily something bad could have happened if we had only continued our journey to Burger King. And the realization that another person witnessed it made it all too real for me. I've been followed a few more times after this event, and it's really given me some extreme anxiety. I think it's pretty damn safe to say that I won't be walking alone anymore. Hell no. For some background info, I just turned 16, and my two friends Ashley and Sarah, my parents and little brother and I all went to Toronto for my birthday. We rented a hotel for the night, went swimming and went to the mall, and it was all really fun. But now, on to the story. The night after we came back from the mall, we went into our hotel room, took showers, and we were all just hanging out there. It was around 11 p.m. and we were all really bored. I knocked on the door separating me and my friend's hotel room and my mom, dad, and brother's room to ask if me and my friends can walk around Toronto because we had nothing to do. My mom said yes, so as me and my friends were about to leave, my little brother asked if he could come too because he was also bored. I said sure, so my parents ended up coming as well because they had to watch my brother. So now we're all on the streets of Toronto, my parents and brother a few meters ahead of us, while me and my friends were a few meters behind, just laughing and talking. I had started to get hungry, so I had told my parents we wanted to get food. We continue walking until we find some two-story building with a whole bunch of restaurants and fast food places in it. It was pretty big, and in the center there was a big escalator to get to the second floor. There wasn't a lot of people in there, but the few people that were on the first floor looked pretty sketchy. We don't see any fast food places on the first floor, so we go up the escalator to the second floor to see what's up there. My parents go to McDonald's and they sit at a table pretty far away from us. My friend Sarah wasn't really hungry, so she went and picked out a table for us, while me and Ashley went to the ice cream place to get something there. As we were waiting, we had seen this group of 3 guys sitting at a table that was pretty close to the ice cream place. I noticed them looking at us and whispering to each other before 2 of them came up behind us to wait in line for ice cream as well. I thought it was kind of weird, but I didn't really think much of it. That is, until one of them started talking to Ashley. One of the guys randomly tapped her on the shoulder, then said,
"Hey, I've never been to this place before. What kind of ice cream flavor do you suggest me to get?"
No, I was a bit weirded out by this because, well, the guy looked creepy as fuck. He was a very tall Jamaican man who looked to be in his late 20s or early 30s, in very bummy clothes, and randomly talking to my friend who was 15 at the time. He was also screwing a lid onto some weird-ass small bottle as my friend was talking to him. My friend Ashley is very friendly, so she didn't really think much of it and she was just being nice to him and talking to him. And then the other guy that was with him came up to me. I had already got really weird vibes from his friend, so I didn't want to talk to him. The guy who came up to me was also a very tall Jamaican man, and he was wearing a white trench coat and a hat. He then says to me,
"Wow, you look really exotic. What's your ethnicity? I gotta know."
I was super weirded out by this and a bit uncomfortable, but I just laughed and said thanks and told him my ethnicity. After that, he then says to me,
"Wow, that's a really beautiful mix. You're a very beautiful girl. Can I please get your number?"
There was no way in hell I was giving this 30-year-old looking man my number. I told him right away no, but he just kept begging for it, saying he just wants to text me and talk. I told him I don't give my number out to strangers, but as I kept saying no to this man, I noticed the third guy that was sitting at their table then get up. He was yet another very tall Jamaican man in a beanie, and he had a briefcase with him. I saw him make dead eye contact with me as he got up, walked to the escalator, and then went down to the first floor. I was about to walk away from this man because this whole situation was just really freaking me out, until the other guy who was talking to my friend Ashley then came up to me and then said,
"So, hey, I got your friend's Snapchat, and I was wondering if I can get yours too."
I told him no, that I don't give my Snapchat to strangers. He then kind of laughed at me and just said okay. Then this next question got me really scared. The man that was talking to Ashley then said to me,
"So, are you two here all alone, or are your parents here?"
I didn't even know what to say at that point. My mind just kind of went blank and I froze. But my friend responded for me, saying that my parents are over by the McDonald's and that our other friend is at the table close by. The two guys looked over at our other friend and then waved at her. Sarah had seen the two guys do that, then looked at me. I think she could tell I was uncomfortable. But right as Sarah was about to come up to us and get us out of this situation, my parents went up to her and they told her they were going back to the hotel room, and that we can just walk back since the hotel was only about a 10-minute walk away from the place we were at, so my mom thought it would be fine. Sarah said okay, and my parents and brother made their way to the escalator. Sarah then came up to us and those two strange men, and then said, "Hey, is everything good over here?" "Yeah, all good. We're just now leaving," I said back. Then the guy in the white trench coat then looks at me and says,
"Oh, okay. Bye, beautiful."
I don't even look at him. Sarah, Ashley, and I just walked back to our table. I didn't feel like staying there anymore and told the girls we should go because I was really uncomfortable. So we start making our way to the escalator, but then we see those same two guys from the ice cream place following us. This is when panic mode then hits me. My parents are gone now, and it's just us 16-year-old girls in this random building with barely any people in it because it was so late. I tell Ashley right away that those same two guys are following us, and she starts to panic too. We go down the escalator, and they do the same. There's only two other people on the escalator separating us from those scary men. Then as we get to the bottom, thank God, I see my parents and brother waiting in the Starbucks line right next to the exit. Me and my friends run up to my mom to go and tell her that those strange men were following us. But right as I look over after telling my mom what happened, I guess the men noticed my parents were still here, so as soon as they got off the escalator, they went right back to the other one to go back up the second floor again. My mom told me that they were leaving to go back to the second floor, so we should just go back to the hotel room. My parents and brother left the building first, then me and my friends left after them. When we got out, my parents were about a meter or two ahead of us, and I noticed the same guy with the briefcase that I thought left the building earlier, standing right next to the exit door, just staring at us. This really scared the shit out of me because I thought he left a long time ago. He literally just stared at us the entire time as we walked past him. I assumed he didn't do anything because he realized my parents were there, but as we got further away from him, I looked back just to make sure he wasn't following us, and I noticed that he went up to some creepy all-black car with really tinted windows, then knocked on the window. Then the guy in the driver's seat rolled down the window, and the man with the briefcase whispered something to him, and then he left the car and went right back to the building that we left from, and the car drove away. This really scared the shit out of me, because if my parents weren't there, I don't even know what could have happened to us, but it for sure wouldn't have been good. I don't know what those men wanted to do with us, or why the men in the briefcase went up to that car, but I don't want to know. We got back to our hotel rooms, and my friend Ashley started crying because it all hit her at once what just happened. Sarah and I tried to calm her down, and then I asked her, "Did any of those guys ask for your number or Snapchat?" Then she told me, "Yeah, I gave them my Snapchat because I was really scared to say no." That's when it then hit her that she has her location on for Snapchat. I told her to go turn it off immediately just in case, but when she went to turn it off, it showed one of the guy's Bitmoji was right next to hers, which meant that he was at or near our hotel right now. She turned it off right after that and then blocked him. Nothing else happened that night, thank God. I'm really glad my parents came with us to the food place, and thank God they didn't leave the building just yet, because who knows what would have happened to us if we were alone. So everyone listening to this, please be safe out there, and especially at night. This happened about a month ago. I'm doing much better now, and for my future jobs, I will never take night shifts, as the dark alone gives me the creeps. I've applied for many jobs because I'm the legal age for working, as I'm in high school. I'm in desperate need of money, and I need to help my family out as well, so at this point, I would take any job I can get. 5 jobs accepted me, so I decided to do a trial at my first job that was pretty quick enough to accept, which happened to be McDonald's. I need to say that the staff and the manager were all very nice, and my friend also works there, which was a total bonus. The only really downfall working there was probably the customers, which my friend agreed. But anyway, I didn't really know what to pick for the shifts, or even if I wanted the job, so I asked for a practice shift. My manager happily agreed and let me choose my times. Instead of daytime shift, I chose the night, which was a very bad decision, but hey, I needed to see what it was like working there anyway, so this will be easy since it's night, right? Well, I was terribly wrong. I got ready in my friend's uniform that she let me borrow, and she even drove me there. I'll be honest, the McDonald's was rather sketchy. When I say sketchy, I mean there's so many alcoholics and druggies around, and upon arrival it just didn't feel right. During the car ride, I had a gut feeling that it wasn't going to be a good shift, but my friend kept reassuring me that all will be fine. She dropped me off at the bus stop, which was 5 minutes from my workplace, and said that she would pick me up at 12 a.m. It was around 10 p.m., so my practice shift lasts for about 2 hours. I agreed and said for her to pick me up at the same spot that she dropped me off at. As she sped off, I merely watched as her car shrunk into the distance. After I saw it was gone, I started walking towards McDonald's, but while walking, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't really think much of it because it was a normal thing. The person was probably just walking to their car or McDonald's or even the shops, but I had a really bad feeling. I felt like I was almost being watched, and I stopped for a second. The footsteps stopped with mine, and I looked behind to see a guy around his mid-40s just eyeing me off. I got really weirded out as he just smiled at me and then breathed very heavily. He was taller than me and he looked rather stronger and bigger than me as well. He was around what looked to be a few meters away. I quickly looked away and ran off to my workplace. There was only about 3 people working, my manager and my male friend. It was about 10:30 p.m. and I had already had a share of drunken rude people filling the orders up or even tried hitting on me. But he quickly left, and shortly afterwards, my friend showed up and helped me. He helped me out with most things, and I felt rather safe with him. He was actually an acquaintance of mine, but we soon grew to be best friends. After I was done taking some drunk guy's order, my friend pulled me aside and asked if I knew the guy outside. I was kind of confused at what he meant, and at first I thought he was just joking around. That is, until he pointed at the right window. My mouth went dry, and my face completely dropped. It was the same creepy guy that was following me before work. But I didn't tell him that. Instead, because I was an idiot, I kinda just laughed a bit and said that it was no big deal. He shrugged it off and we went back into the kitchen. It hit 11 p.m. No more customers were present and the same guy would not stop staring at me. At that point, I kind of just held my head down and just begged, hoping that he wouldn't come in. I could just feel his beady eyes run up and down my body. It was gross. It made me feel dirty. He's been there ever since the start of my shift and has been there for about 30 minutes, making it 10:30 now. I started to panic a bit as I was absolutely begging for him to not come in. In the middle of my thoughts, I heard something. My heart absolutely stopped as I then heard the sound of the door being opened. The creepy guy slowly walked towards my counter, eyeing my whole body until he was right in front of me, heavily breathing and almost drooling. His breath reeked like alcohol and cigarettes. He had a musky scent that, to be honest, nearly made me vomit. Red flags were totally going off, but I just tried to continue with my nice act. He wouldn't stop staring at me. I glanced at my friend who was in the kitchen. He was pretty busy, basically making sure nothing was getting burned. I turned my attention back to the guy and, no matter what I asked him, he was silent. It probably went on like that for about 5 minutes straight. That is, until he finally said something.
Such beautiful skin. So young. Short black hair. Such a nice complexion you have.
Before I could even speak or try and call someone over, something I wasn't prepared for then happened. The old guy launched towards me and tried entering the counter part, which happened to be the same part I was working at. He then looked at me like I was a piece of meat. Trying to climb over the counter wasn't easy for him though, eventually trying to grab me and getting stuck midway as I tried backing up. To my luck, I then slipped and totally landed on my butt. I tried my best crawling away, hoping that he wouldn't pass through. I was of course rather startled and afraid to the point that I couldn't even utter a single word. My friend dropped what he was doing as he screamed for my manager to then come over. My manager quickly showed up, which then made the old guy get back up and then flee. My friend quickly ran to my aid and he took me to the back room, which is what my manager told him to do in order to calm me down. Shortly after, we called the cops. I glanced at my friend as he looked pretty pale and rather puzzled, like he saw a ghost. My manager waited at the counter for the cops. That's when my friend quickly explained who the guy was. As it turns out, the guy was known for creeping on the female staff members while they worked. He would take pictures, ask for their number, offer alcohol, and even documented what they looked like. He was actually already banned from even entering the place or even being near it. The cops were already very aware of who he was due to his creepy behavior in the past. After the whole investigation and getting questioned, it was about 1 a.m. and I was let go. My friend was with my other friend while I got questioned, and on my way home, my friend held my hand and kept reassuring me that everything will be fine. Safe to say, I don't think I'll ever go back there again, and after this, I don't think I trust any night shifts. I think I'm gonna work at a different fast food place as well. So to that creepy old guy who's hopefully in jail, please stay away from me.
I used to work at a Starbucks here in Cardiff, and I've got to be honest, it's one of the better jobs I've ever had. The manager was brilliant, the other staff were nice and looked out for each other, so for a minimum-ish wage job, it was about as good as it gets. The only bad shifts to work were the first halves of Monday and Tuesday mornings, as the pre-work rush meant people were often at their absolute worst. I mean, don't get me wrong, people could be complete jerks at other times of the day or week, but the highest concentration of them was Monday and Tuesday mornings, without a shadow of a doubt. But rude customers aren't scary. Annoying and frustrating, yes. Chillingly cruel and calculating, not as much. Which is why this particular incident has stayed with me for so long, and I always seem to use it as my personal point of reference for how terrible human beings can be to each other. So, it's a Monday morning, and we're just coming to the end of the rush at around 9 a.m. 30 minutes more and the caffeine fiends will start to thin out, and we can get some coffee and make a smoke break of our own. I heard her before I saw her. Like, she was only just trying to get a handle on what had been pure harpy screeches just moments before. Some woman was on her phone, ranting away and not looking where she was going as she tries to find the back of the queue. In doing so, she cuts off this other bloke who politely informs her that she's queue jumping. I don't know if she actually didn't hear him or was just tactically ignoring him, but either way, this bloke has to tap her on the shoulder before saying, "Excuse me, believe I was ahead of you." The woman just shrugs this off at first, giving the guy a gesture like, "I'm too busy to listen to you." I remember the look of anger on the guy's face as she gently but firmly grabs the strap of her handbag and tugs her out of the queue before taking her place. I'm a bit torn about the whole thing. Like, yeah, it was righteous, but laying hands on someone, I feel like there could have been a better way to resolve the issue. But it wasn't like the guy had picked her up and thrown her, and due to the size difference, that was definitely a possibility. Anyway, she reacts like this had been the case, like him actually standing up to her was some horrific incident of assault, and starts demanding someone call the police, even though she herself was on the phone and simply refused to hang up. A couple of staff members and customers manage to calm the situation down, and we get the guy his coffee before one of my colleagues serves the angry woman. I didn't serve her, but when she got her order, she turns to be like, excuse me, this coffee isn't as hot as I asked for." No, I know better than to just argue with customers, and especially absolute whoppers like her. So I do as I'm asked and heat the coffee up a little bit more for her. I hand it back. She dips a finger in it and once again tells me, "This coffee isn't hot enough." Now, bearing in mind, she just watched me run some steam through it, but again, I do as I'm asked and give her back some literally steaming hot coffee that she proceeds to absolutely overload with sugar. No wonder she was in such a stinking mood. Her entire life was probably one big sugar crash, hence why she was such an unbearable person to be around. But little did I realize, that coffee wasn't for her. And on her way out of the store, she took the lid off of her scalding hot syrupy coffee and threw it in the guy's face as he sat reading his newspaper. God, the sound of that guy screaming was absolutely horrific. Like, I didn't actually see the woman throw her coffee in the guy's face, so I thought someone had broken a leg or something. That's the only time I've heard someone scream in pain like that. When my old skating buddy absolutely shattered his leg on this visit to a Bristol skate park one year. But what followed in the coffee shop was pure chaos. People were pouring bottles of water onto this guy's face, ambulance staff and police turning up. I think the woman legged it as soon as she threw the coffee because, to my knowledge, no one was arrested, but the guy who had the coffee thrown on him suffered life-changing injuries. From what another colleague told me, the gross amount of sugar in the coffee meant that some of it actually stuck to his face like a kind of molten hot glue. He'd been left with terrible scarring for the rest of his life, and all because he stood up to some absolute monster in the queue that morning. That's what I find really scary, that some people out there are so unhinged that a seemingly normal interaction with them could end up with you suffering injuries you'll carry with you for the rest of your life. Just one moment of misjudgment, one little enough is enough moment, and boom, you're going to look at a very different version of yourself in the mirror for the rest of your natural life. This was a while back. My husband decided to surprise me with a Valentine's Day suite to a secluded treehouse resort in the upper Ozark Mountains. On paper, it sounded extremely romantic, a getaway for just the two of us with no distractions. I knew he was probably going to try to get frisky as well, because, hey, it's Valentine's, so I wore something revealing and teased the whole drive up there. Unfortunately for us, you could say that the brochure lied. The treehouse looked nothing the way it was shown online. Instead of the sprawling multi-tiered bungalow that spanned the tops of cedars, we basically got a rickety house on stilts. James was furious, and I was upset too, but we had already paid the deposit, and it's not like we could just cancel and go. This was a lot of money down the drain. Needless to say, it made the start of our getaway a bit of a downer. Then as we got into the small room, I noticed that it was beginning to storm. "Should we worry about this place falling down or something?" I asked. I didn't want to be pessimistic, but it was easy to imagine this entire building collapsing because of a gentle breeze. Every time we walked, the whole thing kind of shook. "We should probably stay close to the door just in case," he suggested. Even though things were pretty bad, I still wanted to try and get the best of our time together. After all, it wasn't just about the place. I wanted to really be with him, too. "Let's get into the hot tub," I suggested. James didn't object and got the water running, but it seemed like it took forever for it to get hot, and then it only stayed hot for a few minutes. It was very disappointing, to say the least. "Well, let's just go get a bottle of wine," he suggested instead. I didn't feel like arguing, a bit more frustrated now that everything was turning into a disaster, so he ran out to the car in the pouring rain and brought back a bottle of Chardonnay and a corkscrew bottle opener. "You look sexy drenched," I teased him. He went to the kitchen cabinet and got out 2 wine glasses, pouring us some before offering a toast to making better memories. As we started to drink it, I had this weird vibe, or I guess a premonition, so to speak. I was thinking it would be crazy if James somehow had bit the glass and the wine shards would disperse into his mouth and cut him. A few seconds later, that was exactly what happened. He was taking another sip from his glass when this thing abruptly shattered in his mouth and he started to choke. I felt the whole room was moving in slow motion. I panicked and moved to hit his back, hoping he would choke it up. Then I asked if he wanted me to call 911. He shook at his head negatively and kept struggling to vomit up the blood. Silently, he gestured to help him into the bathroom, where he used his toothbrush to cause himself to gag. I stood there, holding up as shards of glass fell into the toilet. After that little ordeal, we cuddled up in bed and really didn't say much to each other. Honestly, I was starting to think this treehouse was haunted or something. And finally, James made the suggestion that we should go get some food and called around local places to see who would deliver. By this point, the storm had gotten so bad every time the wind shifted our whole cliff house, and it felt like it was actually shaking. It was frightening, but I was trying to find the positive in this insane situation. It truly wasn't easy, especially after that choking incident. "Looks like we'll have to do pizza," James announced after calling 15 places, and you could tell his voice was really hoarse from that experience. It certainly wasn't as bad as it could be, I suppose. I didn't really care because by that point I was just starving and could probably eat anything. "It sounds great," I lied. And the driver claimed it would be there in 40 minutes, so we grabbed a shower while we waited. For a moment, it was nice to just forget about all the bad stuff that we had gone through. When the driver arrived to drop off our food, I was the one that answered the door. Not sure why I didn't bother to get dressed. I didn't see it as important, I guess. He was a younger guy, probably in his mid-20s, and likely hadn't really been around women the way he was ogling me. And I wasn't even really wearing anything that revealing, to be honest. How much?" I said when he seemed to forget why I had even come there. He stammered off the total price and gave us the pizza. My wallet's in the car. 1 second," James said, running toward our vehicle. The pizza guy followed. I was standing there holding the pizza box, watching them both out of the corner of my eye when I saw something strange happen. It looked like the driver had possibly hit James on the back of the head with something. and I later found out it was a tire iron because it had caused my husband to fall unconscious in less than a few seconds. It's hard for me to really properly describe that moment of terror. I knew what was happening, but I still couldn't believe it. This young kid marched back up to me as I stood there, transfixed and paralyzed, holding the pizza box. He had a knife in his hand that looked like it could easily slit my throat, and he demanded that I get on the bed and tie myself up. I climbed on the mattress as he instructed and did my best not to cry. I was sure this kid was about to have his way with me. He demanded that I use the bed sheets to tie up my hands and legs, and I was blubbering like a baby, telling him where my wallet was. Just take it and go. We won't call the cops, I swear," I told him. I didn't want him to hurt me, and it honestly felt like if I had said one wrong thing, this kid was going to snap. This definitely felt like a crime of opportunity. He was nervous and skittish, and was constantly waving the knife around as a threat as I finished up the bonds in my hands. I made sure that my feet were loose enough that I could still fight in case he had any other ideas. Then he took my wallet back to his car and returned with his smartphone. He started to video me. I don't know if it was for his own sick pleasure or what, but I was just too terrified to really say anything unless prompted. A few times he spit on me. Finally, he decided that he'd had his fun and left before my husband finally came to. I sat there tied up on the bed for a good 30 minutes before James came stumbling into the room, looking frantic and confused by what had just happened. We called the cops immediately, but would you believe they didn't even bother to send anyone that night? Instead, we basically got no sleep because I was sure that Psycho would come back. I attended to James's wounds and did my best not to think about the fact that we were basically stranded up here in the mountains with no money. James insisted that it was going to be all right, but I was having a really hard time seeing the positive to any of this. In the AM, the cops finally came by the resort and wrote down everything we had told them, and we both did our best to provide a description of the driver and of his car. It really helped me to realize that I have a terrible memory because, for the life of me, I could only remember 2 or 3 things about this kid. He was white, he wore a baseball cap, and he had a southern accent, not exactly helpful. But the officers promised that they would keep us informed on any developments, and we were supposed to stay there another day and night without any protection. I know it's crazy to think that this psychopath might come back, but I told James that I didn't want to risk it. I don't care about the deposit. I just want to go home. And he agreed. He had already told his mother about what had happened over the Valentines, and she wired some money to his PayPal so we could afford some gas. On the way back home, I was busy calling and canceling credit cards and trying my best to forget about the whole thing. James instead insisted that we both go take self-defense courses, which I was not totally against. It just made me realize that he had been just as scared as me that day. A few months later, after a lot of back-and-forth hassle with the company, we did actually get most of our money back. They admitted in their email that it wasn't the first time their customers had reported suspicious activity on the property. Next time we plan a vacation, I'm picking, I teased James. It's crazy how we kind of laugh about it now all these years later, but dear God, if things had gone differently, I'm honestly not even sure I'd be here today. My 2020 Valentine's was a little different because my family had to move in early February, so we postponed actual Valentine's until close to March. Then the pandemic hit, and I was one of the first in our family to be exposed. My boyfriend said that we could still do our Valentine's over Zoom, so we agreed to the next weekend. Honestly, I felt like one of those kids stuck in a bubble constantly. It was mind-numbing to see others going outside, and I couldn't. I didn't have any symptoms. I didn't understand why I was being locked away like some kind of criminal. Still, my boyfriend Robbie told me that he was going to make Valentine's special and insisted that we couldn't miss it, no matter the circumstances. Saturday rolled around, and as planned, I logged into Zoom, eager for the romantic surprise that he was going to pull off. Honestly, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I doubt it was like anything he originally intended. He had his camera set up right at an angle where I could see him in his entire room, 2 windows that were partially open to let in a breeze as he wore a silly blue suede shirt and matching tie. He had candles going and soft jazzy music playing. It was cheesy, so I couldn't help but laugh and giggle. Just trying to set the mood, he teased. Oh, so sexy, I told him, trying not to roll my eyes. Next, he waved a bouquet of flowers in front of the camera and said, "Roses, your favorite. Don't they smell good?" And that joke was actually in poor taste because thanks to COVID, my sense of smell was completely gone for a little while. "Chocolates for you," he said next, waving a box of filled creamy chocolates near the screen. Then there was a strange noise right outside his window, like a scream, and he told me to hold on. I stopped and waited as he got up and looked out the window, and immediately noticed that panic was gripping his body. He ran past the camera and I heard him go down a flight of stairs. Next thing I knew, I heard more shouting from his open window. He sounded like he was having an argument with someone. Admittedly, my mind was frantically trying to figure out what was going on, and I kept shouting his name, hoping he would get back inside. It actually took him almost half an hour to do so, and I nearly called the cops myself. When he got back on camera, I wished that I had. Robbie had a bloody nose and a black eye, and I immediately asked what happened. "Someone just stole my car," he told me. I'm really sorry, I gotta go," he said. I didn't hear from him until the next day, and the cops found his car parked not far from where I live. According to them, the thief had activated the GPS and gone to the last location Robbie had put it. I suspected that maybe they intended to rob me next. The cops said they found traces of gunpowder residue in the car as though they had been carrying a recently discharged weapon. Robbie confirmed that they had shot at him when he tried to stop them, and that just made my heart sink even more. I didn't even hear the pop go off. I'm not sure why at the last second they decided to just abandon the car, but Robbie admitted to me a month later that he thinks he knew why they stole it in the first place. "I got you a promise ring, and it was pretty expensive. I don't know why I didn't think to bring it inside, but I left it in the passenger side seat. I think that must have been what they were after," he admitted. It truly was the most and least romantic Valentines I'd ever had.
It was a week before Valentine's Day, and junior high school was running along slowly as usual. We were beginning to prep for our cheesy little Valentine's Day thing. Our school's locker had those little vent slits in the door, and every year in between second and third period, the school would give everyone an extra half hour to slide those lame Valentine's cards into people's lockers. I never actually participated in handing out cards, but I still decorated my locker with my name, like most everyone else. That's because people often gave candy bars. I'm talking full-size candy bars, and I didn't want to miss out on that aspect of it. So, before the big day, I sat quietly at my first period desk, and I created the most half-assed name card to tape to my locker. And when the big day did come, I waited to see which fish I would catch. And by fish, I meant secret crushes who had some chocolate to give. On Valentine's Day, after fourth period when the lunch bell rang, I decided to stop by my locker to take a look at the diabetic bounty. But there was only one thing in there, and it wasn't sugar. Inside, there was a folded up piece of notebook paper. It looked like it had been torn from a journal, and there was red lipstick on the upward-facing flap. I was immediately disappointed, but my curiosity had me opening up the sliver of paper before I even knew what I was doing. As I held it, a girl walking by stopped and gasped, and then she just kept walking. This was awkward and weird, but I thought nothing more of it at the moment. I looked down at the simple message scrawled on the note. It said, "Low Water Bridge, 10 p.m. It's been a while." That was it. No name or signature, no X's or O's. If whoever this was really thought I'd go alone to that old bridge at night, they were crazy. I mean, for all I knew, the janitor threw this in my locker, and he was planning to do something very illegal to me. I almost threw it away, but not before showing it to my friend Ethan. Ethan took one look at it, and he made the same face that that girl had made when she walked by my locker. "What? Do you know something about this?" I asked. I was confused. "Maybe," he smiled. He looked conniving. Ethan was the kind of person who was never not joking. "I'll let you in on it if you take me with you." Screw that mess, man. That's how people get killed. I couldn't believe he wanted me to go out there. "Trust me, you're not going to get hurt or anything," he said, seemingly worried that I might refuse still. "I'll even bring my dad's gun. Dude, we have to go." "And when I get shoved into a pedophile's van?" I remained adamant. He thought it over for a moment, and finally he rolled his eyes and replied, "I'll pay you $100. I'll protect you and pay you. I'm that sure about this. I gotta see something." By now my curiosity was overflowing, so I gave in. "Fine," I looked straight at him, "but I swear to God, if this is a prank or something, I'm going to throw you over that bridge." After school at about 9 p.m. that night, I told my parents I was tired and that I was heading to bed early. I walked to my room, locked the door, and climbed out of my window. I made my way over to Ethan's house. His place was only a few blocks from mine. Then we headed together to Lowwater Bridge. Now, Lowwater Bridge was a local old bridge that didn't serve much of a purpose anymore. Back in the day, it carried people over a deep creek. But now, there was literally no water under it. It had dried up. Even when it rained, all that would flow below it was a 2-inch deep stream. Hence the name Lowwater Bridge. Besides, no one ever even drove over the thing. Everyone was so afraid that the bridge would collapse, even if they walked on it. It took us 45 minutes to walk there. The hardest part was hiding in the bushes whenever we saw a car coming. It was so close to curfew, someone would definitely suspect something, or knowing my luck, it would be a cop and we'd be totally screwed. Luckily though, no one saw us. We made it to Lowwater Bridge without too much of a hassle. Once there, we waited in some nearby brush. The wooden bridge looked so dilapidated. I was surprised that it could even support itself, let alone the air above it. As we waited for 10 p.m. to come, Ethan seemed to be acting strange. He was quickly looking over his shoulders, and his eyes were so wide. At one point, he jumped when some small animal moved about in the woods next to us. "What's up with you?" I whispered. It's nothing, man. Just keep your eyes on the bridge." He sounded so anxious. Soon enough, it was 10. I stood up, stretching my tired legs after squatting for 10 minutes straight. Before I walked over to the bridge, I turned back to Ethan and I asked, "You will be watching me the whole time, right?" "Yes, dude, I promise." He was so serious now, not like he was at school. I actually believed him. Now I was beginning to get nervous. I started walking, trying to tread softly so that I could hear any and all noises around me in case there was any funny business. But it was quiet, unnaturally quiet. In between the slight crunches of gravel underfoot, all I could hear was my own breathing. Eventually, I came to the edge of the bridge. I didn't step onto it yet. I didn't really feel like dying today. I turned to where Ethan was, and he raised himself over the brush. He was making hand gestures toward me. He wanted me to step onto the bridge. I swallowed hard and continued. The first step made the wood underneath me creak, and it echoed throughout the woods around us. It was terrifying. It felt like it took ages to reach the middle, but the moment I did, I stopped and I listened. It was no longer silent. There was a very faint sound in the air. It was rhythmic and high-pitched. It got louder by the second, until soon I could make a guess at the noise. It sounded like a young girl humming a tune. I had no idea what tune it was, and that didn't really matter at the time. It sounded like someone was coming, but the humming itself seemed to be coming from every direction at once. I was beginning to panic. I turned to Ethan, silently asking him permission to get off the bridge, but when I saw his face from the bushes, my heart sank. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was open. And then I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I was done. I ran from that spot, not even stopping to grab Ethan, but thankfully he ran as soon as I did. We did not stop until we got to my house, where we literally collapsed from exhaustion. We were on my front lawn on our backs, trying to catch our breaths for the next 10 minutes. When we could finally speak, I asked him, "What the heck was that? Who was behind me? Did I almost get kidnapped?" He stared back at me with the widest eyes. No. It was nothing like that, man. So it's all true," he said to himself. "What? What's true? You said you'd tell me if I went with you. What's this all about?" I was desperate for an answer. Then he explained it to me. Apparently, it was a local urban legend. Every year, someone would get a note in their locker on Valentine's Day. On it, there would be red lipstick and a message to go to the low water bridge later that night. No one ever did it though, so a lot of people believed it was just a prank and they would throw the note away. The story goes, it all started in the 1980s when a certain girl attended our school. Nobody knows her name, so we all call her Lisa Black. She was a troubled girl who was bullied by her peers. On a cold February 14th, she jumped over Low Water Bridge, which at that time had deep flowing waters beneath it, and she drowned. Ever since then, every Valentine's Day, someone would receive that note in their locker. That note with a request and a red lipstick stain. Personally, I'm not sure if I even believe that story. I don't know how I didn't hear it the other 2 years I'd been there. I mean, it could have all been a prank that was never revealed to me. But what I can't explain, though, was the sound of the humming that came from every direction, and the look on Ethan's face of sheer terror. After all, I had never seen Ethan so serious before in my life. This started when I was in middle school. I was 12 at the time, so having a Valentine was everything to me. I was a social kid, and I liked this boy. We'll call him Kenneth. And honestly, I thought he liked me back. Every day of that February after lunch, there were little notes that someone put in my locker. I thought it was weird because his locker was far from mine. But I was a daydreamer. I just thought that he liked me back, that he liked me enough that he would leave notes for me. The day before Valentine's, a kid that was very skinny and was wearing a black hood with a Lions logo stood in front of my locker, blocking me from it. "Hi," he said, shivering. "Would you like to go on a date?" I had never seen this guy before. I was trying to see how awkward it would be if we were on a date, and we didn't know what to talk about. "Sorry, I have plans," I said, and I walked away. It was really weird. Later, I was walking home and I stopped to get something from Target. I was looking at some candy bars when I noticed someone that was as tall as me. He had this hood with a Lions logo on it. I left with the candy bar and I started to make my way home. I called my mom to tell her that I was going to be late. There was a shortcut that was an abandoned train station. I would only take it when I was going to be late. As I was walking, a bush next to me started to move. And I don't know why, but after what I saw at the store, I freaked out, and I ran the rest of the way home. When I finally got home, I got out my phone and I saw a text. It was from an unknown number. There were pictures of me running and me walking around the store. I immediately showed them to my mom, and she simply said it was probably friends. Friends or not, that's simply creepy. The next day I showed my friends the number. They looked at the number and said, That's the weird kid's number. I know because he gave it to me and I never texted him." This really freaked me out. I still see him around the school, but when I do, I'll glare at him, and I try to keep my distance. And number 6, The Break-In, submitted by Ralph. For this story, I will need to tell you a bit of background information. I am 6 feet tall, 16 years old, and I live in a very small country named Latvia. Probably some of you know it. I have shared this story only with close friends, other family members, and my parents. We live in a 2-story house, and my room is on the 2nd floor. My parents often leave me home alone because they travel a lot for work things. This happened on Valentine's Day 2015. It was a cold winter night, and I had just broken up with my girlfriend, so I was completely alone to watch the house. It was around 8 that night. I was downstairs watching TV shows on Netflix when I heard a light knocking on my living room door. I got up to look outside, and there was no one there. After an hour or so, I heard the tapping again. I peeked outside, only to see someone running by the bush where the road leads to another street. I thought someone was pranking me, so I didn't really care too much. After a half hour of watching TV shows, I got bored, so I asked my friend to come over. He lived about 5 minutes away from where I live. For safety purposes, I'll call him Jake. Jake was shorter than me and a year younger. He came over and we played some video games. After a while, I needed to go pee, so I went upstairs to use the bathroom. When I got back to the living room, Jake told me he heard tapping on the window. I wasn't surprised, and I told him before he got here I heard the tapping too. 1 hour passed, and then we heard the tapping coming again, and we ignored it. After about 3 minutes, we heard footsteps upstairs, and that's when things got serious. We muted the game. The footsteps stopped. We thought the footsteps were in the game, so we continued to play, trying to listen at the same time. Then we heard something heavy fall upstairs in my parents' bedroom. I paused the game and me and Jake went upstairs. We checked every room. We checked my parents' last. I peeked inside the room and saw nothing. It was pitch black, and I turned on the light and went into the room with Jake behind me. Jake checked the closet and I checked everywhere else. As we were leaving the room, I forgot that we did not check under the bed, so I hesitantly asked Jake if he could just quickly look. He walked over slowly, obviously a bit anxious. He looked under the bed, and he jumped up faster than I've ever seen him get up. He bolted out of the room without saying a word, and I quickly turned off the light and slammed the door shut. Jake was already downstairs. I rushed down there to him, and he was pale as snow. I asked him what was wrong, and his answer made my heart sink. He said there was someone under the bed, smiling with eyes wide open. We rushed outside and called the police. We hid behind a bush that was in front of my home. As I was on the line with the police officer, Jake and I saw my parents' bedroom light come on. I asked them to come over as fast as they possibly could. We watched the house for about 10 minutes, but we saw no movement inside. When police finally arrived, 2 officers went to search the house, and the 3rd officer asked a couple of questions. After a moment, the 2 police officers came out of the house with a middle-aged man. He had a long beard with wide, bloodshot eyes. His face was full of scars and bruises. Now I get why Jake looked so pale. One of the police officers told us that the man had a knife hidden in one of his pockets. He had broken in by an unlocked bedroom window, but how on earth did he get up to the 2nd floor? I have no idea. The police called my family, who said they'd be back in town as soon as they possibly could. Nothing like that has happened since that day, but I still get goosebumps thinking about and writing this, because it sounds like, even if I didn't invite Jake over, I still wouldn't have spent Valentine's Day alone.
So this happened about a year ago. I know it because it was around Valentine's Day and I'd spend the week leading up to it just dreading it. Stalking my ex on Instagram and generally just felt pretty terrible about myself. We'd split up a few months earlier and she kept the flat we'd lived in, seeing as she did most of the work finding it. Her friend moved in and I moved out. It was a simple but painful arrangement. I ended up finding a flat for myself way out, on pretty much the outskirts of the city. I don't know if you've ever been to London, but flat prices are stupidly high, and if you want anywhere that's more than just a bed and a toilet, you have to abandon any hope of living remotely central. So the Valentine's Day season came around, and one weekend I was feeling fairly sorry for myself, working my way through a bottle of Prosecco. I should have really been sharing when I made the decision. I changed the radius on all my dating apps to be as small as possible, and tried to see if I could get a Valentine's date lined up. Half the time you matched with someone, and they'd reveal that they were on the other side of London to you, and your attempt to organize a drink would fall through. "It's too far," or "I don't have time tonight, maybe next week," were phrases you'd hear all the time. So, I'm not the most attractive guy. I think I'm honest enough with myself to say that, and I have a pretty good gauge of when someone I've matched with seems too hot to be real. Usually my hunches confirm when they send me a message advertising some Russian dating site in the first minute. Anyway, I meet Becca, who seems lovely, and very much in my league, and who lives actually not too far from me. We agree to go for a drink at the Crown the day before Valentine's Day, so as not to have the awkward expectation of anything extra romantic, which is pretty much the local for anyone who lives near my overground stop, and I'm pretty excited to be honest. She seems pretty funny. Maybe not wife material, but we get along, and for a while the thought of my ex off on her own Valentine's Day seems a lot less unpleasant. So, date night comes, and I have my usual beer or two before for a bit of Dutch courage and head off to the Crown. I send her a message to let her know that I'm on the way, and she says cool, she's almost there. It's a little dark out, and there's a thin mist of rain, but I shrug it off. It is London after all. The walk to the pub doesn't usually take too long. You have to navigate loads of little back streets that ends up slowing you down a whole bunch, and I spend a little extra time to avoid some alleyways, just because I've heard stories about people getting mugged around here. But I arrive to the Crown only a bit late, and send her a message apologizing as I get in. She replies pretty quickly, instantly almost. "Shoot," she says, "didn't get a chance to message you. There's a bunch of guys in there for someone's birthday, and they're being really rowdy, making me a little uncomfortable. I've nipped over to a restaurant down the road to see if they might have space for us." I mean, she's not wrong. There are a bunch of guys in here being loud and obnoxious, and I guess if you were a small woman, it would make you pretty uncomfortable. Not only that, but a group are smoking outside and jeering, and I could see how you wouldn't want to hang around outside for long. She sends me the restaurant's name and tells me to hurry. They'll save a table for us if I'm quick. This is where I get a little concerned. We never agreed to dinner. Not only that, but when I put in Google Maps, the location gives me 2 routes. One is pretty quick, and the other adds an extra 10 minutes onto your walk time, easy. The only issue is the shorter route goes right through this old estate that's semi-abandoned. I say semi because although I'm sure people live there, I'm not sure who, and half the buildings are boarded up. I take one look at it and decide that there's no way I'm going through there. There are barely any streetlights, if any, and I can barely make out much more than a few dark shapes. I decide to take the longer way around and apologize to her, but let her know that I'll be a little later. She replies instantly again and tells me that I need to come now and that I should just be as quick as possible. I don't like her tone and tell her there's no way I'm walking through the old estate at night. Now I'm beginning to feel really uncomfortable and am aware of how alone I am on this route. Whilst it passes by several houses and shops, there's no one actually on the street itself. There aren't many people out on the night before Valentine's Day, and come to think of it, I've got no idea why the restaurant would be so full in the first place. I get that funny feeling in my stomach where you know something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it. And for some reason, I walk in the middle of the road for the last stretch. I think maybe I felt a little safer there, or at least in my head I think I'd be able to see anyone who came towards me. Thankfully, no one did. I did manage to freak myself out a little, catching my reflection in shop fronts and car windows, and have to make a conscious effort to not look at them because I know I'll only freak myself out more. I'd have turned right around, but I realized that I was actually closer to the restaurant than the original pub, and at this point I just wanted to see another friendly human face. I sped up my walking slightly, made sure to text a couple of friends just to be safe. All this time I'm walking, she's messaging me telling me just to hurry up and that the shortcut's fine, she literally just took it. But as soon as I mention I'm almost at the restaurant, she stops replying, just like that. One moment she's telling me to hurry, and the next, as soon as it's clear I'm not going to use the shortcut at all, she's gone. Well, they're gone, I suppose. No way of knowing who it was. I get inside, and like I suspected, the place is fairly empty. It's definitely not booked out, and when I ask if the waiter's seen any woman like Becca asking about a table, he shakes his head. Not tonight, he tells me. Only a couple of families and an older couple. I think about texting whoever was claiming to be Becca, but even opening the conversation gives me the creeps. The idea that there's a couple of days' worth of chatting there, of whomever was on the other end pretending for whatever reason to be a normal person, gives me the chills. It's strangely weirder to think of someone that creepy pretending to be normal in a weird way. I think about walking back using the road, but I realize, looking out the window of the restaurant, that whoever was pretending to be Becca knows my exact location. They'll know I arrived and found out they were lying. I think about the fact that they might be watching me from somewhere, my silhouette in the window, and I ask if I can have a table whilst I order an Uber home. Even during the ride home, I hate the idea of my face near the window, and I try to lean into the middle seat. I get the driver to drop me as close as possible to my house, and my heart races the whole walk home. I never told them my address exactly, but the idea that they know the area I live in is enough to make me start looking at flats on the other side of the city. I think, as soon as I can, I'm going to move.
"6 years ago, I worked as a delivery driver for Domino's. For me, it was a pretty easy job to just drive around town delivering pizzas, plus I made some pretty good tips. I lived in the city, so I would never have to drive all that far. This was also my main way of earning extra money during my summers home from college, and I would generally work some pretty late nights. One night, I remember that it was a Friday, which are always really busy. I was driving all over the place around town for hours, until finally it started to quiet down after midnight. At about 1 o'clock in the morning, we got another order for a delivery that I took. It was 1 cheese pizza and an order of cheesy bread, and I put it in my car and started driving. Once I got closer to the location, I realized that it was not for a house, but a business. It was still in the city, but a more industrial side of town where there appeared to be a bunch of warehouses. I arrived at the address and saw that the special instructions on the order said that they wanted it delivered to the back door in the alley. I drove around back to find a dark alley with some dumpsters and then a small set of concrete stairs that seemed to lead to the building. I drove around back to find a dark alley with some dumpsters and then a small set of concrete stairs that led to a back door of the building. I'm not going to lie, it was a creepy scene with no other cars or people there in a back alley in the middle of the night. I had a job to do though, and I got out of my car and walked up the steps to the back door. I knocked on the door and waited there for a minute, but nobody answered. It was extremely quiet, and nobody else seemed to be around at all. I was beginning to wonder if I was at the correct building, so I looked around for the address to make sure. But just then, I heard a noise come from about 10 feet away from me. I looked and saw a man come from behind a dumpster that was sitting on the other side of the stairs that I was on. He was wearing sunglasses even though it was night, and started walking towards me. Based on the way he was walking, it didn't seem good, and I backed away from my car. Then, I saw another man come out from behind the other side of my car. He was also in sunglasses, but other than that, I couldn't really give a good description. They both were coming towards me at a pretty fast-paced walk. I knew I wouldn't be able to get to my car, so I jumped over the railing of the stairs to the ground below, which was only about 5 feet. I then ran out of the alley as fast as I could. I could hear the men chasing after me as I did, and it sounded like there was a third person among them running as well. I was somehow able to outrun them to the end of the alley, and once I was there, I turned for the street and tried to run to an area where there was more people. I panicked and ran into the middle of the road, where a car was coming and started honking at me. I got out of the way just in time, and was lucky enough to get to the other side of the street. The men stopped from chasing me and were still at the other side. From there, I called my boss and told him what happened. I made my way to a nearby convenience store and waited. It ended up being a big deal, as the building that I was instructed to deliver the pizza to had not actually ordered the pizza, meaning whoever lured me there was possibly setting me up to get robbed or something like that. The police were called, and I quit the job shortly after. This happened about a year ago. It was a Friday night, and I was hanging out with my girlfriend at her place, and we were trying to decide what movie we were going to watch. We ordered Domino's, some pasta and a pepperoni pizza, and I offered to go pick it up. There was a Domino's roughly 5 minutes away, so it wasn't a big deal for me to drive over and get it, and then I wouldn't have to spend money on a tip. When the food said it was done, I got in my car and left. I got to the small restaurant, which by this time was roughly 11 p.m. and was pretty quiet. I parked in the small parking lot beside the restaurant and walked inside. There was nobody at the counter as I walked in, so I stood there and waited. After a few seconds, I saw a woman briefly come out from the kitchen area and said she would be right with me in a moment. Then she disappeared again away from the counter. I said that was fine, and I stood there waiting. I looked around the small lobby. I wasn't in a big hurry or anything, so I didn't mind, and I knew that it being a Friday night, they were probably really busy with deliveries. Then, as I looked behind me at the window going outside, I saw a man who had his face pressed up against the glass window of the store, looking right at me. He had a scraggly beard and appeared to be in his 30s. He was just staring at me with a somewhat angry look on his face. I didn't know what to do and just turned back around. I was expecting him to come inside the store, but he never did. I faced the counter and then looked over my shoulder again to see that he was still there and not moving. Finally, the woman came back and asked me for my name of the order. As she did, she seemed to see the man in the window and asked who he was. I said I didn't know and I found it strange. She kind of laughed it off with a nervous and awkward laugh. Then I told her my name and she said she would go get my order. As she was getting it, I could see movement out of the corner of my eye. I saw the man suddenly dart away from the window and run away. I figured he was just some crazy guy and I was glad that he was gone. A minute or so later, the woman came back with my order, and I took the boxes and left Domino's. I walked to the parking lot on the side where my car was, and saw that the weird guy from the window was now standing by my car. I felt really awkward now because this man seemed to be a little crazy, and I knew I'd have to walk right past him. I was also concerned with him being right next to my car. I slowly walked over, and the man looked at me and smiled as I did. He didn't come closer to me though, which was a relief. Eventually, I was able to make it to my driver's door and get inside. I said goodnight to the man and drove away. He just stood there smiling at me. I began driving the 5-minute or so drive back home, but as I pulled onto a busier road less than a mile later, my car suddenly didn't feel right. The front wheel seemed like it was coming right off. I stopped the car on the side of the road and got out. I walked over and looked to see that all the lug nuts on my right front wheel were loosened almost all the way, and the wheel of the car was starting to come off. I couldn't believe it. I immediately thought back to the man. I was kind of more out in the middle of nowhere now and was driving away from the businesses in town. I got up my phone and quickly called my girlfriend. I got back inside my car then and waited for her. Luckily, she could come and pick me up with her car, and she arrived just a couple of short minutes later, and we went over to get a wrench. We were gone for only about 10 minutes, but when we got back, my driver's window was smashed. At that point, we called the police. They came out to the area and we told them the whole story. I believe that man I saw was trying to hurt me, and he returned to my car and smashed the window after he realized I was gone. I'm grateful that I narrowly missed him. A few years ago, I worked at Domino's Pizza. I worked there for roughly 1 year, and for the most part, I liked it. One time, though, I was working a night shift like I often did. It was sort of busy, and we would typically get a lot of phone calls for pizza orders, and I would answer them a lot of the times. On this night, we got another phone call at about 10 p.m. I answered it, but on the other end, I didn't hear anything at all. I said hello several times, but there was just silence. Just as I was about to hang up the phone, I heard on the other end a loud and really creepy sounding laugh. I said hello one more time, and when I did, the laugh only seemed to get louder. It gave me the creeps and I hung up on them. I kept working and answered several more calls over the next few hours, until after midnight I got another call which was the same creepy laugh. I asked who it was, but of course they didn't answer. This time, I kept them on for a little bit longer, but all they would do is laugh. Eventually, I hung up on them again, and that was the last call I got that night. Over the next few days, though, it started happening more often. It happened about 5 times, and I told my coworkers about it. They hadn't experienced anything like it, and it would only seem to happen when I answered the phone. I was starting to get really annoyed and also seriously creeped out by these calls that kept happening. The person on the other end of the phone was usually laughing, but sometimes there would be a whisper which I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then they started just doing other random things like not talking at all or hanging up right away. I figured it was just a stupid prank, but I couldn't help but be a little bit scared. Then things got even worse. One night, when I was at home, I received a call, and when I answered it, I heard that same creepy laughing. I had no idea how they got my number, because it had only happened at work. I asked who it was once again, but all I heard was the same old laughing. Then they started whispering once again, and I couldn't make it out at all. Eventually, they hung up on me. I was really creeped out now, and didn't know what to do. I was home by myself, so that made me worry even more. I ended up calling my best friend and telling her all about it. She came over that night, but there were no more calls. The next night, I got the last call that I ever received from that person. It was more hysterical laughing, and it got louder and louder, until finally, there was a scream at the other end of the phone, and they hung up. This time, I was the most creeped out that I had ever been, and once again, my best friend came over. She spent the next few nights at my place. However, that was the last call that I ever got from the number, and they never called me again at work or at home. I sometimes wonder who it was and why they were calling me. I go to Taco Bell all the time. Most of the time that I go, it's during the late nights. I'm a senior in college, and I'm always busy with work and school. For the last few years, I've often drove to the Taco Bell drive-thru after long nights of work or studying. One night, about 2 months ago now, I was really hungry at about 11:30 p.m. when I got done with work. I drove to the nearest Taco Bell, which was about 10 minutes away, and pulled into the drive-thru. This particular Taco Bell location was open until midnight every night of the week, but it recently had been closing early on some nights because they had been short in employees. As I pulled into the drive-thru without really thinking, I noticed nobody else was in the drive-thru and the lights to the restaurant seemed to be off. I knew they closed the lobby of the restaurant earlier than the drive-thru, so I wasn't really sure if they were still open or not. I drove to the speaker and rolled down my window. I didn't hear anybody on the other side, and there was a few seconds of silence. I said, "Hey, are you guys still open?" and waited for a response. Several seconds more went by, and still there was nothing. I knew at this point they must have been closed, and I started to roll up my window when I heard something from the other end. There was a man's voice speaking, but I couldn't understand anything that he said. It sounded like when you have your mouth way too close to the phone, and you can't understand any of the words. I asked him to repeat what they had said, but there was once again no response. This time, I decided to just drive away and go somewhere else. I pulled slowly through the rest of the drive-thru. As I got to the first drive-thru window, I could see that there was nobody there and the lights inside were off. Then I saw the second window, and the lights were off as well, but there appeared to be a man in the window looking at me. As I passed by the window, I watched him quickly duck down as if he didn't want me to notice him. It was strange, but another thing struck me as being even more weird. The man was wearing what appeared to be a clown mask covering his entire head. I drove over to a nearby gas station and got food there instead. The next night, I found myself in a similar situation of getting off work later at night and was once again really craving Taco Bell. It was only 10:30 this time though, so I decided to go back and see if they were open. When I arrived, I could see there were several cars in the drive-thru already, and so I pulled in. They were in fact open, and I was waiting in the line until it was my turn. I ordered, and when I got to the window to pay, I asked if they had changed their hours. The woman working told me no, they had not changed their hours, and they had just closed at 9 the previous night due to a short staff. I mentioned how I had seen a man inside the window with a clown mask on at almost midnight, and the woman seemed surprised. She told me she had closed the place herself and left at 9 o'clock, and when she did, nobody else was there. When I drove home that night, I couldn't help but wonder who it was that I had seen the night before in the window. I used to work at Taco Bell in the past. I worked at a Taco Bell that was about 15 minutes away from my parents' house. I worked there for a few years from my senior year of high school through my first 2 years of college. I liked the job a lot and made lots of friends. But with working late nights, I would occasionally see some weird things. But the strangest thing to ever happen was my last year working there. The Taco Bell location that I worked at was open until 3 a.m., and I would often be closing as I was on this particular night. I worked mostly just during the summer, so I didn't mind it too much. There was just the two of us working at the time. We usually didn't get too many customers this late, unless it was a weekend, and being a Thursday night, it was pretty dead for the last couple of hours. At about 2:55 a.m., literally right before we were about to close it down and go home, I saw a car pull into the drive-thru. As we were still open for 5 more minutes technically, I decided to not tell them that we were closed and take one last order. I spoke to the driver and asked what his order would be. I waited for a response for a while, but there was none. As I looked at the camera at the car, it appeared to still have the window rolled up. I waited a little while longer and was starting to get really annoyed because I wanted to go home, and now I had to wait for this person to order. Finally, I saw the driver's window roll down, but it looked like there was nobody inside the car at all. The driver's seat was just empty. Nobody was in the passenger seat either, and I was really confused. I decided to say to the driver that we would be closing, and if they wanted to order anything, they would have to do it right now. I didn't get any response. Instead, after about 10 or 15 seconds, the car just drove forward slowly ahead. I was so confused as to what was going on. How was the car driving if there was nobody in the driver's seat? I shook my head and then told Damien that they didn't order anything, so we could close it up. Just then, we heard the sound of knocking coming from the drive-thru window. It was 3 loud and solid knocks. I walked over to the window and saw that the same car had stopped at it. I opened up the window and looked out, but saw that there was nobody in the car once again. The front window was down, and there was nobody in the driver's seat or the passenger. I thought it had to somehow be a prank. I stuck my head out of the window to get a better look inside the car, and saw that there was nobody in the back seats as well. My jaw dropped and I couldn't believe what was going on. I got a creepy feeling and stuck my head back inside and closed the drive-thru window. I then watched as the car drove away. Damien and I were both extremely puzzled by this. We closed up after that and both went home. I don't remember anything else as strange ever happening. This story happened about 5 years ago. I was on a road trip with my friend Anna. We had been driving all day, and late at night we both got really hungry. By this time it was nearly midnight, so as I drove, Anna looked on her phone for places nearby that were open. We were kind of in the middle of nowhere and unfamiliar with the area. As we drove on the freeway, it was pretty much just fields on both sides. Anna was saying that her phone was really slow and she wasn't really getting a signal out here. We kept on driving for about 20 more minutes until we finally saw an exit sign with several food places on it. We pulled off the exit and quickly saw that the only places that seemed to be open were a gas station and a little Taco Bell. There were several other buildings in the small town, but all of their lights were off. We first stopped for some gas and then pulled into the Taco Bell drive-thru. We got to the speaker to place our order, and as I was beginning to talk, I heard what sounded like a scream coming in the background. It sounded like someone was screaming help, but it abruptly got cut off. After a few seconds of silence, a man's voice came back on to say that they were closed. Anna and I both found this very bizarre, and we had a strange feeling about it, so we decided to go inside the restaurant. We went to the door and saw that according to their hours, they were still open. When we tried the door, it was unlocked, but nobody seemed to be inside. The place was very quiet. I walked over to the counter and stood there. I thought I heard someone talking from the back, but I couldn't see them. Finally, a man walked to the front of the counter and told me that they were closed. He wasn't wearing a Taco Bell uniform though, and didn't seem friendly at all. I mentioned that the hours on the door said they were still open, and the man just shook his head and said that it was wrong. He started to walk away when I mentioned the screaming I had heard and asked if everything was all right. The man paused for a second and then smiled a little and stated that it was just another employee joking around. He then asked us to leave. As we turned to walk back out, I once again heard another scream. This one was very loud and I could clearly hear someone screaming for help. The man then shouted at us to get out in a very loud and angry voice. We both ran out, but as soon as we had gotten outside, we decided to call the police. I just wasn't believing that those screams were a joke, and the man definitely seemed to be hiding something. We waited in our car in the parking lot for a couple of minutes until the police showed up. They went inside, and it wasn't long until we saw them leaving with the man we had seen. Later on, it was explained to us that there had been 2 employees working when a man came in and attempted to rob the restaurant. One of the workers struggled with him and was knocked unconscious, and the other employee was taken to the back of the restaurant when we pulled into the drive-thru. I'm glad we showed up when we did, or the man may have gotten away with it.
I'm a 20-something guy living in the middle of Tennessee. Before this bizarre experience, I'd been going to college full-time to be a paralegal. One day, though, my mother broke her hip after falling down the stairs. She was 52 at the time, and my dad had passed a long time ago, so it was on me to take care of her. We didn't really have anyone else. I was forced to make myself a part-time student, because I would have to get a job to help her afford some of her medical bills. At the time, thanks to my late dad, I had a fairly new car, and I figured it'd be fun and easy to deliver pizza. I loved to drive. Where I lived, there was a lot of scenery, and sometimes I even went on drives just for the sake of it. As you can probably guess, it was easy to get the job. I just applied at a few local places and called each of them the next day. Before I knew it, I was delivering pizzas wearing a Domino's hat. Delivering pizza wasn't hard. I can be completely honest with you about that. But delivering can be insanely stressful. You've got to get there at a reasonable time. You keep hoping that the order was made correctly, because you can't just send it back to the kitchen when you're miles away from the restaurant. And last but not least, you find yourself praying that your next customer isn't a prank or a complete jerk. I can't tell you how many jerks I've delivered to. Jerks who didn't want to pay because I wasn't able to give them one more pack of Parmesan cheese. Well, there came a day when I had to deliver a large pizza to an address I did not recognize. The place was about 10 miles away from the restaurant in an area we all infamously called the Boondocks. It was an area that I'd personally never been to, but when I saw it on my drive, I would describe it as a country region of town where there's only a single trashy house every 5 minutes on the road. And I'm not trying to be rude. These places looked beat up, old, and ransacked. It was honestly hard to believe that people still lived in those places. I was fully expecting at any moment to witness a drug deal, or to have someone step out in front of my car to stop me and try to sell me meth. Needless to say, it was a bit of a creepy place. Given that it was getting dark out fast, I was ready to get the delivery over with. I arrived at the customer's address rather quickly, thank God. Luckily, this house was far cleaner than all the ones previous. It was a small white home with a short paved driveway and a seemingly untouched screen door in the front. The yard was well kept and clean, and the grass looked to have been cut recently. Also, there were no cars in the driveway, but I still assumed someone was home to pick up the order. I got out hesitantly and I grabbed the pizza. The carrier was still hot enough to burn my skin if I held it in one spot for too long. This was good. It was probably our most common complaint we got, that our pizzas were too cold or not hot enough when we dropped them off. So that was one thing I didn't have to worry about. With some flimsy confidence, I began to walk up to the screen door. When I was nearly at the porch, I could now see a faint light through the front window, and that's when I saw the silhouette of someone looking out at me. Someone standing there, watching me walk up to their door. Good, I thought. This will be quick. I made it to the front door, cleared my throat for whatever reason, opened the screen door, then knocked on the wooden door. With the first knock, the door slid open. The door hadn't been closed at all, so when I knocked, it opened further. but I swear, there's no way it should have opened that much from a single light knock, because the door in a matter of seconds was wide open. I could now see inside. I could see the faint lighting from what appeared to be 2 dim lamps in the living room. I could also see a small, maybe 28-inch TV in the living room, displaying a silent, flat blue screen. For several seconds, I didn't realize that I was holding my breath. I could feel goosebumps coming up on my forearms. What in the world was going on here? Hello? I said. It definitely wasn't loud enough to get anyone's attention, though. So instead, without stepping through the doorway, I knocked on the open door, hoping to let someone know that I was here. I waited for at least 2 minutes, but I didn't hear a soul. Nobody walking or talking in the house. No sign that anyone lived there. I stood there, frozen and silent, trying to listen. "Behind you," a voice whispered. I felt breath on the back of my neck, cold, chilling breath. Immediately, I spun around. I did it so quickly that I dropped the pizza inside its carrier, but I didn't care. I ran back to my car and was ready to peel out of there. But I made the mistake of looking back at that dang house. I saw it in the window. The silhouette of a person standing there, still watching me. Except now, they were waving. I hauled tail out of there. When I made it back to the restaurant, I was written up for failure to deliver and for losing my pizza carrier. I thought I was going to be fired, to be honest with you, but I think my manager just went easy on me, as she knew the situation with my mother. On one of my rare days off, one of the days I didn't have to work or take care of my mom or go to school, I went back to that strange neighborhood. I found that house again, but it took me a while to be sure that the place I was looking at was really the same place. Because even though it had been about 2 weeks since the incident, the place was a wreck. The screen door was hanging off of its hinges with holes in the screen. The white paint on the outside was now an off-white or nearly yellow, with patches of chipped paint, and the lawn was now a jungle with random auto parts scattered about. I gathered my courage and drove back to the nearest neighbor I could find. I knocked on their door and excused my intrusion. Then I asked them if they knew anything about the strange house. To my surprise, they did. The house was the home of an old man who struggled with his drinking. Apparently, he drove his kids away from frequent abuse, and once those kids left his life for good, he took a shotgun and ended his own life. I was covered with chills as I listened to the story. It was like some sort of ghost story you'd see on TV or hear from an urban legend, but this was real. I'd lived through it. After the man told me that that house hadn't had electricity on for the past year, I thanked him for the information and I bid him good day. I stopped delivering for Domino's after that. I didn't feel like delivering to any more strange places, and I got a better job offer as a manager at a local Subway. Still, sometimes I get a chill on the back of my neck, and I can't help but think about that voice saying, "Behind you."
My name is Kenneth. I'm 22 years old, and this story happened a couple of months ago. I had just gotten a job working nights at an Amazon warehouse near where I live. On my shifts, there weren't that many of us. It would just be me on my own doing my work somewhere in the warehouse. I think it was my second night at work when the security guard who worked there introduced himself. His name was Vincent. He was a large man, slightly overweight, in his late 30s. He was friendly at first when we started talking. Mostly small talk and interests we both have. He asked if I wanted to go get a beer and maybe see a movie the following Friday, as we both had that day off. I agreed as I didn't have any plans and I don't go out too often. That Friday in the evening, me and Vincent met up at a bar near where we work. Everything went okay. We had some drinks, talked about sports and previous jobs we worked. Then we headed out to the movie theater. That's when Vincent started acting weird. We bought our tickets and headed to the theater. I needed to use the bathroom, so I went. I was standing at the urinal doing my thing when I heard a bathroom door open. I couldn't hear any footsteps, but I didn't think twice about it. Then I turned around. I saw Vincent standing there watching me. His head was down, but his eyes were up, and he was just smiling at me. I jumped and I laughed, saying he startled me. But Vincent just stood there looking at me. It was like he was angry almost, with a weird smile. It's weird, you would have to be there to understand. I just walked past him and said I would wait for him outside. That was the first red flag. Then as we were in the movie theater watching the movie, I swear he was staring at me. I wasn't certain, but I could see in the corner of my eye that he was turned staring directly at me. I was too freaked out to check, so I did my best to focus on the movie. The next thing that happened was Vincent started rubbing his hand on my thigh. That was it for me. I got up and I walked out. The next week at work, Vincent came up to me and asked if I wanted to go hang out. I looked at him confused and annoyed at the same time. I thought me up and leaving was obvious. I wasn't interested and don't want anything to do with him. I told him no, I'm busy, and carried on working. Fast forward a few weeks later of him asking me and hanging out and texting me, calling me. I really had enough. So the next time I saw him in work, I told him I don't want anything to do with him and to leave me alone. I turned away and carried on sorting boxes. Vincent walked away and I thought that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. Later that night, I decided to take a break and go to the bathroom. I sat inside one of the stalls to answer a few texts. I then heard some heavy boots stumping down the corridor, then into the bathroom. I opened the stall door to see what was going on. Before I could open the door, it was kicked into me, causing me to fall backwards, and then Vincent was on top of me, putting his hands all over my face, trying to cover my mouth, and then he started strangling me. I was losing consciousness, but I still remember the look of Vincent's face as he was choking me. His face was red and his eyes were wide as they could be. I thought I was going to die, but for some reason Vincent let me go and left the bathroom. I sat up trying to catch my breath. I was still in defense mode because I thought for some reason Vincent was going to come back and kill me, but he never did, thankfully. I reported what happened to the manager. He looked on the CCTV camera and I called the police. You can see me walking into the bathroom, and about a minute later Vincent rushes in. At that point, Vincent had left the warehouse and went home. Well, that's what he told the police anyway. I'm going to fast forward what happens next and say due to no proof of Vincent attacking me, the charges were dropped against him. He even got to keep his job. I felt that justice had been taken away from me, and there was no way I was going to continue at Amazon, especially with that maniac still working there. I left that job, obviously, and currently have a new job. I hope and pray for.
In the run-up to Valentine's Day of 2015, I found myself with a rather unfamiliar feeling. Loneliness. From 2010 onwards, I'd been so focused on med school that I was content to barely have a social life, and content to have a non-existent romantic life. I told myself that it could all wait until I was done with school, and that frankly it would be irresponsible for me to curate distractions for myself while I was trying to reach the first milestone in my career goals. But after most of my high school friends had graduated and my social media feed began to swell with pictures of their dates, weddings, and pregnancy pictures, I began to feel like that I was really missing out. Call it social pressure or just plain loneliness, but I began to tell myself that it wouldn't be terrible if I just did a little casual dating, especially around the most romantic time of the year. So I did what most younger folks my age do, and I downloaded one or two of the more popular dating apps. Being a woman and all, I didn't have any trouble getting matches. The trouble was actually finding a guy I liked after the opening conversation. So many of them seemed either too into it or clingy or way too cool and uninterested. The last thing I wanted was someone who'd badger me during intense periods of study, but I also didn't want to just be some player's option either. I know that sounds like I was asking for the impossible, and trust me, for a while, I thought I was being way too picky. But then came a guy that we'll call Ryan, and I only give him a fake name to protect the innocent. Ryan seemed charming, intelligent, and respectful, but he also took a while to answer my messages. I know that last part seems like a weird thing to count as a virtue, but I wanted a guy who had his own stuff going on. I liked the idea that he was sometimes just too busy to talk, and I guess that's because I saw a little of myself in him, but I digress. Out of all the guys I spoke to, Ryan was 100% the leading candidate. So there came a point where I straight up asked him if he had any Valentine's Day plans. I'm quick to add that I didn't ask him out. I just asked if he had plans, then waited for him to take the hint. Thankfully, he did, and he told me he knew of this cute little Portuguese bistro-type place that did some of the best seafood he'd ever had. Now, he didn't know this. I have the most boring Anglophone surname ever, but I'm actually a quarter Portuguese, so I basically jumped on the offer and got super excited for the date. Valentine's Day fell on a Saturday that year, and I remember that because we ended up having to stew on a waiting list before our reservation was confirmed. Obviously, the will we won't we drama had me even more excited than before, and when the time came to actually go meet him, I was feeling very romantic indeed. He looked amazing too. 3-piece suit, perfect hair, plus a little tactical stubble that accentuated his masculinity. Then, when he took off his jacket, hung it over the back of his chair, then rolled the sleeves of his white shirt up. My God, I thought I was going to explode with desire right then and there. We talked, picked out some appetizers, and for about 45 minutes the date was going incredibly well. But then, I saw 2 people walk into the bistro that looked very, very out of place. Ryan had his back to the door, so he didn't see them walk in, but I did. And right away, their state trooper uniform stuck out like a sore thumb. I'm sure you know the kind I'm talking about. The Smokey Bear hat with the super shiny tie clip thing. But as much as they initially grabbed my attention, I didn't want to be rude and interrupt Ryan in the middle of an anecdote. He definitely noticed me looking over his shoulder, but they were nothing but momentary glances, so not nearly enough for him to stop talking and looking around. Out of my peripheral vision, I see the cops being greeted by the restaurant's maitre d'. Then, I see the maitre d' pointing in our general direction. But again, nothing to be too concerned about. But then, the 2 cops started walking past a row of tables in our direction, and this is when I have to break eye contact and look up at them, because they stop right next to our table. Again, I've changed some of the details to protect the innocent. "Sir?" one of them said. Ryan looked up before the cop continued. "Are you Ryan Smith of 111 Residential Street?" Ryan responded in the affirmative, then asked if there was a problem. My heart and mind are both racing by this point, and in those few split seconds, I figured something terrible had happened to someone Ryan knew. That, or there had been like a break-in at his home or something. I never, ever would have guessed what the cop said next. Not in a million years. Then, as almost everyone in the restaurant is looking at us, wait and kitchen staff included, one of the cops says, "Ryan Smith, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of..." Enter girl's name here. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law," etc., etc., etc. And I think my jaw must have been touching the tablecloth as I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Like I said, almost everyone in the bistro was looking at Ryan as the cops walked him out in cuffs. Then suddenly, once he was in the back of the cop car, they all started looking at me. I can safely say without a shadow of doubt that this was the single worst moment of my life so far. It was a cocktail of absolute horror for me. Everyone's eyes on me, coupled with the embarrassment of having my date arrested while assuming everyone was thinking, what kind of girl goes out with a murder suspect? Is she dumb? Is she in on it? It was just awful. And then it hit me that if he really had killed some poor girl, was I his next intended victim? Did I just avoid being murdered by a matter of minutes, hours, days, or weeks? Was he looking at me with those big warm brown eyes while thinking, she's so smart and pretty? Or was he looking at me all hungry because he couldn't wait to hurt me? I barely remember walking out of the bistro, and the next day when I returned to pick my car up, I had to ask the maitre d' if I had walked out without paying. Turns out I hadn't actually paid. but the restaurant's owner overheard about the whole thing and told me that all the food and drink we'd consumed was on the house. It's a little acts of kindness like this which slowly restored my faith in humanity because, believe it, it had been badly shaken by the events of that Valentine's evening. I only really remember getting into the front seat of my car, calling my mom, then just ugly sobbing into the phone while she asked me, "Are you okay? What happened, honey?" Over and over again. Once I was finally able to get the words out, she told me not to drive home in such a state and to take a cab, and she was right. Even though I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol that evening, I was definitely in no fit state to drive. I suppose at that point I should just cut to the chase and tell you all what you want to know. And yes, Ryan was convicted of murdering the girl whose name I've chosen to omit. I was actually kind of hoping it was all just some horrible mistake, and that I hadn't seemed so dumb or naive to have gone on a date with an actual murderer. But nope. As the months went on, it progressed from an arrest to a trial to a full-on murder conviction. Ryan had gone on a date with some sweet, unsuspecting girl, taken her back to his apartment, then strangled her to death in the middle of being intimate. I remember my roommate saying that it might have been a kind of horrid accident, but it wasn't. Ryan had deliberately killed her, at a time when she literally couldn't have been more vulnerable. It might seem strange, but I did end up finding a kind of closure after the whole thing, and I recommend this variety of cognitive behavioral therapy to anyone who suffered a similar trauma. I wrote Ryan a letter, or more accurately, I wrote a letter to a prisoner number and addressed it to the correctional facility he was being held at. I couldn't even bear to write his name, nor could I bring myself to write mine either. He'd know who I was certain of it, and in the letter I told him in no uncertain terms that I hoped he would rot and burn forever. I told him a bunch of other things too, but those aren't fit enough to be reprinted anywhere remotely civilized. I don't know if he ever opened or read the letter, but the detective that I was in contact with informed me that it would most certainly be delivered. I hope he read my letter, and I hope it cut him up inside. I wanted him to feel as mortified and ashamed as I did in that bistro on that chilly Valentine's evening. I wanted him to read my words, and as he was reading, I wanted him to pray for the ground to just open up wide and swallow him whole, just as I did when all those people were looking at me with burning judgment in their eyes. I wanted so many things from that letter, but I only got one of them: closure. Some of you might be wondering why I haven't named anyone or anyone in this account. It's for a number of reasons, but the primary one, I know this for certain, is that the family of the girl my date had murdered requested the privacy and space to grieve following his trial. Unfortunately, this wasn't respected by elements of the local and national media, and the family ended up suing one of the more unscrupulous publications regarding an article they posted online. If you ask me, it was righteous litigation, and although I wouldn't be all that worried about them suing me, given how closely connected I am with the case, I'd like to respect their wishes for privacy and anonymity. On top of that, I'd like you to respect my privacy and anonymity, at least until my prospective killer is released. Because then, I'll go public, truly public, and no matter how much my prospective killer tries to carve out a new life, a new identity, or a new existence, I'm determined to make sure that everyone knows what a monster he really is. Back when I was still in high school, I used to work as a waiter at this super fancy restaurant on the corner of the Common. I worked there for 2 Valentine's days, and I've never understood why people didn't want to work them. Not the first year anyway. Tips, they were awesome. So the next year, when I wasn't even on shift, it was real easy just to make a swap so I could get all those Valentine's tips. So, this guy comes in, good-looking dude, but his girl was like Rihanna level hot. It was all eyes on her all night long. There was almost a fist fight in the back to decide who got to wait that table. Okay, maybe not a fist fight, but I personally witnessed 2 games of rock, paper, scissors, and they were low-key intense. Anyway, the night goes on, we're working steadily, and the tips are just mounting up hour by hour. The dude was treating his girl to all kinds of bougie cocktails, insisting she have dessert, the most expensive entree, stuff like that. And the whole time we're just like, yes, dude, boost that percentage, boost it. It wasn't my table, so I couldn't keep track of the exact amount he dropped on her, but I know it must have been like $500 and change based on the pricing. But as they're wrapping up, I'm just waiting to see what kind of cut I'd be getting. When out of nowhere, a solo girl walks into the main dining area. She's not wearing anything fancy. She's looking like she'd actually been crying, and I remember watching her look around the dining room for a second or two before honing in on the dude and his Rihanna twin. You know when you just know something messed up is about to happen, and you can just feel the tension rising in the room before it suddenly explodes? I think everyone in the main dining room picked up on that as she powered over to the Rihanna girl and started screaming in her face. I remember watching our bartender, this big tattooed dude called Harley, walking over to her, getting ready to separate them or whatever. But before he got there, the crazy girl grabs one of the wine glasses from the table and just yeets it into the Rihanna girl's face. Harley goes from 0 to 100 trying to get over to stop it. This place was super fancy, so it didn't have security or anything hanging around anywhere. In fact, we barely had any trouble at all. So when the situation exploded and diners were screaming and trying to get away, Harley was slowed down by all these people trying to get out of the dining room while he was trying to get in. Then, in the meantime, the girl is just going ham on Rihanna with this broken wine glass. Before I actually come out of shock in time to act on it, she's picked up another glass and yeeted that one into her face too. Then get this. Instead of actually helping his date, the guy actually just bailed out of the booth and ran out of the restaurant along with the rest of the customers. Total scumbag move, man, and something I'll never forget. Seconds later, me, Harley, and the rest of the waiting staff had basically body slammed the crazy girl away from Rihanna, while she herself had slumped down under the table to get away from the attack. The cops eventually showed up, took the crazy girl away, and once the scene was safe and clear, the EMTs showed up to treat the injured girl. I hadn't seen her at any point after the attack, not until the EMTs actually started treating her. And honestly, I couldn't even recognize her face. All around her eyes and nose, it just looked like ripped up red, and her upper lip was almost cut all the way in half so you could see gums and teeth and stuff. It was one of the most horrific, upsetting things I'd ever seen, and every single Valentine's Day since, I'm reminded of that poor girl and the horrific injuries she suffered at the hands of that psycho ex, or whoever she was.
My grandfather grew up in Jacksonville, Texas back in the 1950s, and if you've never been there, you wouldn't be missing much. He grew up the eldest of 5 brothers and sisters on a farm with my great-grandparents. He passed away about a year ago, but I wanted to share a story he told me when I came home from college break. Naturally, Grandpa didn't come from much. His parents' generation suffered through the Great Depression, and farmers didn't fare off too well. But being the gritty Texas farm folk that they were, they thrived in it. Having a farm and a big pasture surrounded by pine trees made for a good childhood, as he told me. He would reminisce about the times of gathering the whole town's kids and playing baseball games to pass the hot summer days. Though as his health deteriorated, he began to talk more deeply with me, and would talk to me about life lessons, and one thing in particular, fear. He asked me if I had ever heard of witches. I said of course, but he stopped me, and as serious as he could be, he asked me again. Listen, I ain't talking about no Halloween characters. I'm talking about actual witches. I could tell it made him uncomfortable talking about it. It really screwed him up as a kid. He explained to me that he had 3 encounters growing up. The first time he saw her, he was 10. He and his siblings were playing around sundown. They were outside in the pasture. About 200 yards away from him, there was a tree line where a forest began. He said that he saw a dark floating silhouette by the tree line. He couldn't focus on it because of the lack of lighting, but he swore to me that the figure's head was cocked at a perfect 90-degree angle looking right at him. He said it was inhuman. He remembers rushing the little ones back inside and telling his parents. Their parents never let them out after sundown again. The second encounter came 2 years later. He and a friend who was their closest neighbor would walk on a trail through the forest to school every day. He said it was about a 2.5-mile walk. One day as they were walking home, they saw a homeless person covered in quilts walking on the left side of the trail. Being very confused and uneasy as to why somebody they didn't know who was completely submerged in dirty quilts would be walking on this trail in the woods. As the person passed, he said they both smelled something that was a mix of rot and sour. Upon smelling the putrid odor, Grandpa said that he became very dizzy and incoherent, and the neighbor boy felt the same way. A few moments later, they hear a sinister giggle from behind them. They turned to see this person, who was still completely hidden by the quilts, began running after them. He said the thing didn't stop chasing them until they busted down the front door of the farmhouse. He never saw the neighbor boy again after that day. The incident was widely spread around town and quickly became a warning for all those who would venture in the woods. The third and last time he saw the witch was when he was a senior in high school. Grandpa was going to be a Division I football player for the University of Oklahoma and quite frankly was the hometown hero. He said that he just met my grandmother and really wanted to enjoy the rest of his senior year, so he attended a prom after party in the woods with his classmates. Being that his class only had 60 people, everyone was there. He admitted that he got pretty wasted that night. He went to go take a leak a couple of yards away from the bonfire. While he was draining his lizard, he heard shuffling noises from nearby. As he tried to focus, he made out a small hut through the trees. There was a stream of smoke emanating from its chimney. He smelled a stench that he recognized from when he was 12. He told me that nothing else could have sobered him up so quickly. He proceeded to investigate the hut deep in the forest. As he approached, a dark figure appeared from the shadows, but he told me that no matter how hard he tried, he never could quite make it out. All of a sudden, the figure started to whisper. It intensified, and he felt a burning sensation on his arm. He felt as if his body was being branded. The figure then slowly faded back into the darkness of the forest. He became frantic and realized that he was now 100 yards away from everyone. He said that there was no way he had wandered off that far. He began screaming for help. He admitted to me that he even wet his pants. The creepiest part about this story is that the police investigated the hut that my grandpa discovered. Inside was a gore fest. There was dead animals strewn about the floor, as well as human remains, who some believed to be the missing neighbor boy. They never found out who was responsible, and my grandfather moved away shortly after. My grandfather was a fantastic man, and I miss him a lot. He was the most kind, loving man I ever knew, and I know that he wouldn't make any of this up. And I've also always wondered where he got the burn mark on his arm. Some backstory before I begin. I work for a conservation corps based out of Austin, Texas. We do a lot of environmentally based projects, such as trail maintenance, wildfire fighting, invasive species removal, etc. One day this past spring we were working in Jasper, Texas, doing invasive species removal on Nature Conservancy property. We were clearing any and all species that were not longleaf, shortleaf, or loblolly pine trees. The property was about 60 acres, so we were flying through this project trying to complete it. Most of our chainsaws had run into problems and were not working properly, so we ended up having to split up into groups. I worked in a crew of 8, and we only had 4 saws running, so groups of 2 was the reasonable way to run things. I was working with one of my coworkers, Joe. We were on an area of property that the crew had not been to yet. Our job was to cut a trail about a mile into the property and proceed to make our way around the 60 acres. We began to saw our way in at around 7:45 a.m. We had to hike in our fuel, bar oil for the chainsaw, our wedges, and our packs. We each carried a hatchet in case we needed an extra wedge or for any other reason, as well as flagging to mark the trail. At around 9, we had reached our halfway point and decided to take a short break. I shut off the chainsaw, took my chaps off, and drank some water to cool off. I placed my pack against the tree, and Joe did the same. We began shooting the shit. Nothing unusual. Just some stupid banter to get through the day. As we were talking, something snapped in the brush about 30 feet to the west of us. I instantly stopped talking and grabbed our hatchets. This area was known to have wild boar. We knew what to do in this situation if a wild boar was to show up. Nevertheless, we were scared. We slowly walked over to the brush, and as we approached, another snap came from our south, about 30 feet in the dense brush. At that point, we were starting to get nervous. We had no plan if 2 boar were to show up. We decided that it was best to grab our packs and find our way back to the crew. They would understand us ceasing work for 2 boar. As we slowly made our way back to our packs, snaps came from every direction. We had nowhere to go. My first thought was to grab the chainsaw and turn it on. I revved up the engine, but it promptly died. Great. Another saw down. In simple terms, we were screwed. We decided to make a run for it at that point. I counted down from 5, and we both ran down the trail as fast as we could into the thick swampy brush. We sprinted as fast as humanly possible towards camp, but something made us stop. Joe and I, at the same moment, stopped running. We stood there not knowing what to do. Joe began to look around frantically, and as he did, I felt a cold breeze wisp down my back. A deep voice whispered something into my ear, but before I could even comprehend the words, I took my hatchet and swung blindly behind me. To my surprise and terror, it struck something hard. As I turned my head to see what creature had just met its doom, I heard Joe gasp. As my head swiveled, behind me was a tree. This may sound normal, but we had cleared this area of all life not but 30 minutes prior. The chances of us missing a 2-foot wide, 60-foot tall tree were 0. Realizing that this was only a tree, I looked back at Joe, ready to laugh, but as soon as I turned around, Joe was gone. I chuckled and started to call out his name. After about 2 minutes, I began to freak out. I began frantically searching the surrounding area, but Joe seemed to have vanished into nothing. After another 10 minutes of searching, I decided that he may have been so scared that he ran back to camp, so I began to make my way back. When I arrived, everything was completely normal. Everything but the fact that Joe wasn't there. I told everyone that Joe had gone missing after we had a run-in with some boar. We all spread out. We looked for Joe for an hour before deciding to call the authorities. They arrived shortly after. We set up search parties to find Joe. After about 10 minutes of searching, he was found. Joe sat on a tree stump, pale as the moon, staring off into space. I called out to him, but when he looked at me, I noticed blood running down his stomach. There was a tree branch sticking out of Joe's gut. I sprinted over to him as he fainted and caught him before he hit the ground. The police rushed Joe to the nearest hospital. Before we left, I noticed something odd. Joe had been sitting on a stump of a tree that I had rammed my hatchet into. The tree was no longer standing, and my hatchet was sitting in the dirt, covered in blood. My stomach dropped, and I immediately walked with my crew back to camp, leaving my hatchet behind. We packed up our campsite and left Jasper that night. We were never sent back to that property. Shortly after, an article surfaced in the news of a Nature Conservancy surveyor who disappeared in the same forest. They found him a week later impaled next to a tree stump. I can only assume it was the same stump that we found Joe next to.
I experienced this back when I was 14. Now I am 23 years old. Back then I lived on the outskirts of a small town in Montana. Behind my home there was a forest. Now, I had never stepped a foot into those woods until that day. The only time I'd ever even gotten close to that forest was when I was tasked with walking my family dog Charlie. Now, Charlie was a big dog. I had never seen him cower before. On one of our walks, I heard a noise in the woods. It was the sound of a branch snapping. Occasionally, whenever I took walks with Charlie, I would keep hearing these noises. One thing to mention, though, is that whenever I took Charlie out during the day, nothing would happen. But during dusk or dawn or even nighttime, I would always hear this noise. The day I decided to head in was an extraordinary day because it was my 14th birthday. After everyone was in bed, I had snuck out with Charlie and we navigated our way through, or, well, tried to. We ended up getting lost and came upon an abandoned shed. Then, the last thing I expected happened. Charlie started whimpering. That was never a good sign. I had wondered if there was someone there, but I couldn't see anybody. I didn't think I would need any form of protection, so I didn't have any. And then, I heard the sounds. A crunch here and a snap there, and the animals went quiet. I was terrified, so all I could do was run to the shed and hide. Something got closer. I heard the leaves crunching. It was the only way I could tell how close it was. Then, a loud bang resonated through the woods. It was walking on top of the roof. I couldn't stop shaking, but I'd like to think that Charlie could tell how scared I was because he started licking me. Around 5 or 10 minutes later, I hopped off the roof and I peeked out the nearest window. There was a human-like creature out there. Grotesque, with long limbs, pale skin like the moon, jagged bones and joints. It was extremely thin. Its spine was protruding underneath its skin. Instead of bumps on the spine, they were like tips of a knife. I felt sick to my stomach, and I almost hurled right then and there. I felt like I was seeing something I shouldn't. I managed to see its face. It was roundish. Its eyes were beady and black. They looked soulless, but I'm not completely sure. They were glassy like the eyes of a doll. Lifeless, and soon it had started to walk away, but not without turning back to me and letting out this demonic roar, like the roar of a lion mixed with the caw of a raven. I think it knew I was there. I don't know what prevented it from killing me, but whatever it was, I'm eternally grateful. Remember, if there are woods near you and you hear strange sounds, never forget that there are things out there that won't be as merciful as it was to me. If anybody knows what this may have been, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm incredibly curious.
It all started on the 7th of February. The small independent coffee shop I was working at had decided to throw up a few decorations for Valentine's Day. So myself and a few colleagues had spent pretty much our entire shift putting up pink and red bunting, writing romantic quotations around the edges of our blackboard menu, and other romantically themed stuff. It was a fun way to spend a shift, but as I clocked out and began the short walk back to my flat, I began to feel a slight pang of loneliness, knowing I'd be single and alone on the day itself. I consider Tinder or Bumble to try and bag myself a date, but the chances of securing myself a boy that I actually genuinely liked over the next 7 days was slim to none, so I resigned myself to another Valentine's on my own. But when I got home to find a pink envelope in my mailbox, I must admit that it brought a little smile to my face. A secret admirer, like something right out of a cheap romance paperback, might not be every girl's cup of tea, but to be honest, it really cheered me up, even if it was from a friend or the nice lady that lived on the ground floor flat. Only when I open the thing up, it just says, 7 days to go. No romantic message, no kisses or hearts, just those 3 words scrawled hastily onto the paper inside. It's then I realized there's nothing on the envelope or the paper it contained that confirmed it was actually addressed to me. No name, no address, nothing. I started to feel a tad silly, like, what if it wasn't meant for me at all? What if someone had sent their little Valentine's card to the wrong person? I told myself I was just being silly, but kept the envelope and card as I walked upstairs to my flat and got on with my evening. I honestly think I'd forgotten the whole thing by the next morning when I got up and set off to work again. But when I got home, there was a stark reminder that this was no mistake. Arriving back at my flat, I checked my mail to find yet another pink envelope inside. Not only that, but a small brown paper package was stuffed inside too. Again, I have to admit to being kind of excited about the whole thing. There definitely hadn't been a mistake of address or anything. I mean, the person must have had to put all that stuff in there themselves. Maybe I really did have a secret admirer, and that Valentine's was about to become something out of a fairy tale. But as soon as I opened the package, I knew something wasn't quite right. Inside was a small brown teddy bear. Only it wasn't newly bought, nor had it been looked after very well in what was obviously a long and grubby existence. To be frank, it was filthy. The thing looked like it hadn't been washed in years, decades even. The fur was all grimy and matted together, and one of its glasses was missing, probably having been pulled out by a child some years before. The note inside the envelope was pretty much the same as the last one, only this time it read, 6 days to go. That's about the time that I realized that whoever was sending these wasn't exactly all there, and what had previously been a kind of giddy excitement turned into nervous anticipation. And the more I let my mind dwell on it, the more and more frightened I became. This wasn't going to be some dream romance. In fact, it was more likely to be the polar opposite. I told a friend in work about the whole thing, and they seemed to take it much more seriously than I had. They told me I obviously had a stalker, that even if this person was doing this stuff out of affection, it was still crossing a number of personal boundaries, and I should consider contacting the police. But to tell them exactly what? That I had a note addressed to no one, from no one, with absolutely no other details than I'd found them in my mailbox. Alright, it wasn't exactly the dream romantic gestures that I think all girls kind of crave, but at the same time, why cause someone the distress of calling the cops on them? That felt kind of cruel. But after returning home that evening to something else in my apartment, I didn't feel so apprehensive about contacting them. I arrived home again that evening to find exactly what I expected in my mailbox. Another note, this time reading, yep, you guessed it, 5 days to go. I stormed up to my apartment, grabbed a piece of notepaper and a Sharpie, and wrote out something along the lines of, "Whoever is leaving stuff in my mailbox, please stop. It was sweet at first, but now it's kind of creepy. No more, or I call the police." I made an effort not to come across as too rude or aggressive, but I also needed to make it clear that I really didn't appreciate their unwanted attention. I taped the note to the front entrance of my apartment building before I went to bed, hoping whoever it was would get the message and leave me alone. So, little side note, I get a shower before bed every night without fail. I'm almost sort of a clean freak. I keep my bathroom pretty much spotless. So as I finish getting washed, something small catches my eye. Something that might not even gain the attention of most people, but to me, it stuck out like a sore thumb. A flash of color in what is an otherwise pristine white bathroom. On the window's ledge was a tiny, glassy dome shape, just sat there on its own. I approached curiously, peering down at it for a few moments before I completely freaked out and ran out of the bathroom to call the cops. It was a small, glass eye, a minuscule amount of fabric woven into the back of it. I recognized it almost instantly as the missing eye from the teddy bear that I'd found in my mailbox. While I was on the phone to the police, I realized a few things about my prospective Valentine. As I said, I get a shower every evening before bed. I like hot showers, the steamier the better, so naturally the bathroom window spends a lot of time ajar to let out the moisture. Whoever managed to put that glass eye on the bathroom window ledge had known my evening routine. They had obviously been watching me for long enough to work out the exact place to put something so that I'd see it. But it was their method that really creeped me out. The way they used the small, Teddy's eye to tell me in so many words that they were watching me. I swapped the note out I'd written for one that simply read, "The police have been contacted. Leave me alone." And leave me alone they did. But the whole thing had a pretty serious effect on my psyche for a long time afterwards. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at someone in the coffee shop or someone walking past my flat, wondering if it was them. If one day one of them would look over and smile, and I'd just know they'd not given up just yet.
This happened a couple of days ago to me and my girlfriend. We were house sitting for my girlfriend's dad. My girlfriend's dad lives in a rather large house in a suburban neighborhood, just outside one of the major cities in Denmark. What I'm trying to say here is that his neighborhood isn't exactly scary or dangerous by any means, which only meant that this gave us a bigger scare than it probably would have had it been in one of the more dangerous parts of town. After coming home from buying groceries and stocking up on necessity for our weekend stay at his house, we went to the living room to lie down and have some quality time for ourselves, which we hadn't had in a long time. Now, before I go any further, just let me clarify the lay of the land here. This house had a rather large living room, and a floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the room. Outside this floor-to-ceiling window is a sensor-triggered light system. As we were lying there watching TV, I get this weird feeling that something is watching me. At first, I try and shake it off, like it's no big deal, thinking to myself it's probably just because I'm in a new house, where I don't yet feel entirely at home. But as I look to my girlfriend, I see too that she is quite shaken up about something. After a few minutes of silence, she then asked me if I have the same feeling as her, like someone was watching us. I try to play it off as nothing, and I tell her that I'll just go grab a cigarette and check to see if anyone's out there, just to make her feel safer. As I turn my head towards the floor-to-ceiling window, I notice that the lights are on. Now this shakes me to my very core, and I quickly decide not to go out for that cigarette. By this time, I feel my girlfriend's hand squeezing my arm. As I turn around to her, I see her pointing out one of the windows, and outside is a silhouette of a person. My blood freezes. In that moment, I turn around and quickly grab my phone, and as I turned back, the person had disappeared. I call my parents, as I know they were out at a friend's house not too far from where we were. My dad tells me to lock all of the doors and windows and just sit tight and wait for them to arrive. A couple of minutes go by, and nothing happens, other than me trying to get my girlfriend to calm down, as I know how this affects her blood sugar levels, and I would rather not have her have a seizure while a creeper or burglar or even a murderer is walking around outside the house. The silence is then broken by the sound of windows being tampered with. At this point, I'm trying really hard not to freak out and cause any further panic. But luckily, seconds later, I hear my dad pull up outside the house. My girlfriend and I have since discussed who it might have been, and we've come up with a few possible suspects, one of them being my girlfriend's crazy mother, who has a severe mental illness. The other more possible suspect would be just a simple burglar. I don't really care who it might have been. I'm just glad whoever it was didn't manage to break in. This past August, I picked up a lot of side jobs house sitting, while working at a ranch that gave horseback riding lessons. The families were all very nice and it paid well. This past November, I was house sitting for a family and watching their Labrador retriever named Maggie while they were on vacation. They lived in a very nice neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The house was on the far end of the neighborhood, and thick trees flanked the backyard, and a dirt road ran behind the trees. I accidentally went down the road the first time, and tried to find the house, but there wasn't much down there. Just an abandoned house with lots of deer in the front yard, and a small run-down ranch house. The first night, everything was great. but the second night, not so much. I had this weird feeling a few hours before I went to bed, but I wrote it off as spending too much time reading creepy stories on Reddit. I made sure all the doors were locked, blinds were closed, and I went to bed just after midnight. But as I fell asleep, I still couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Maggie usually sleeps with me, but that night she just followed me up the stairs and to the bedroom, and then just sulked back downstairs. At 2:26 a.m., Maggie woke me up by standing next to the bed and whining. I had just let her out before I went to bed, and I was pretty sure she didn't have to go to the bathroom. I rolled over and hoped that she would stop, but she didn't. I gave in soon enough, and as I climbed out of bed, I realized that the house was freezing cold. I followed Maggie downstairs to the kitchen. All the doors to the house were weird. You can't open any of them from the inside or outside without a key. Not to mention this was a very heavy door, not the kind that just gets blown open by the wind. The only thing that eased my mind was that Maggie didn't seem ready to kill an intruder, and she'll usually at least bark at you. So I did a quick look around. I was too scared to do anything more. Nothing seemed out of place. The owners often left credit and debit cards, as well as wads of cash lying on the counters, and it was all there. If anyone was going to steal something, it was right next to the door, and easy pickings. But since nothing was missing, I tried to brush it off as just forgetting to lock the door. I made sure it was locked this time and went back to bed. Maggie still didn't want to sleep with me, and went back downstairs. Less than an hour later, she woke me up again. This time, I didn't question her. I crept back downstairs more cautiously than I had before. The back door was open again. This time, the key that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was in the lock. Someone had been in the house with me. The police were called. They looked all around the house but found no one. Everything of value was still in place, so I was really worried about the intentions of whoever broke in. The family was shocked that something like that happened and have since moved to a large farm 20 minutes away and now have video surveillance. This happened to my sister about 15 years ago when she was still in high school and I was in middle school. Our mom worked as a house cleaner and always became friends with everyone's home she would clean. One of the homes was owned by an older couple who had no kids but had a huge house and a really nice pool that they would always invite me and my siblings to come swim in. The husband worked as a COO of a large airline company, and they lived in a very nice neighborhood on a large lot surrounded by forest. When you were in their backyard, you couldn't see the other houses at all, just trees. It felt very secluded. Their house was very angular and architecturally interesting, with multiple levels made from stone. Pretty much every room had huge floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the backyard and gave great views during the day. At night, however, the reflection from the inside lights prevented you from seeing out, so it was always a bit unnerving to walk by them since you couldn't see what was out there. The couple also decorated with old Native American art and masks, which was a little creepy to a middle schooler, but the couple were very nice and not so creepy, so I never got too scared. They had an older golden retriever named Samson that lived up to his name, as he was massive but had a sweet and gentle temperament. They also recently rescued a husky mix named Sadie, who was the polar opposite, Psycho Sadie, as we so lovingly called her. She had intense separation anxiety, and she would destroy their house whenever they left her inside, jump their short fence if they left her outside, and if they took her with them to run errands, she would destroy their car and howl non-stop until they returned. So since they were wealthy and had extra money, they would pay for me or my sister to come over and dog sit while they went out. We got $20 an hour, so we were always excited to go over there and watch cable and swim in their awesome pool. Normally everything would be fine, and both dogs would usually just lay around. But occasionally Sadie would realize that I was a stranger and go nuts and start barking at me, and I watched her eyes literally turn red. I was convinced that she was going to attack me, but she eventually calmed down after I got up from the couch and showed her how big I was. Not, but I digress. This particular incident happened over Easter weekend, while the homeowners were out of town for 2 days. They were paying my sister to stay there over the weekend, and I stayed with her the first night. Because it was a big house and kind of scary to stay there all alone, we stayed up late watching movies and eating junk food. The next day we swam in their pool and hung out. But for some reason I didn't spend the night again, and I'm so glad I didn't. Because what happened that night scarred my sister for life. It all started when my sister was working out on their treadmill. Their workout room was on the bottom floor of their home, which was a walkout basement. Just outside the room was a huge sliding glass door that opened to their patio and pool. She had the TV on in their workout room. As she was running and watching TV, she thought she heard the house alarm beep like it did whenever the door was opened. She stopped the treadmill and went to look around and saw that the sliding glass door was opened. Now this door was huge. There was no way it could have opened by itself, so she was instantly freaked. However, the dogs were just lying there in the workout room, and she figured that they would have gotten up to investigate if someone had come inside, and because Sadie was a bit crazy and hated strangers, she thought that she might have accidentally left the door open, and just imagined the beep of the alarm, and that it could have come from the TV or the treadmill. She closed and locked the door and went back to working out. A couple of minutes later, she had the distinct feeling of someone watching her. She looked around, but no one was there. She finished her workout, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She decided just to go to bed, as she was becoming a little creeped out, and just wanted to forget about it. She went around and made sure all the doors were locked. The owners didn't give her the alarm code, so she couldn't set it. She took a shower and locked herself in the guest bedroom, with both dogs, just in case, and eventually fell asleep. A couple hours later, she awoke with both dogs growling at the door of the room. Now, it was fairly normal for a psycho Sadie to growl and bark for no reason, but Samson had never barked or shown any signs of aggression, so immediately my sister knew something was up. She was shaking and trying to convince herself that the dogs had just heard an animal and that it was nothing. But then she heard the dreadful door alarm beep. She called my dad in a panic, crying and screaming, and he told her to hang up and call the police, as he was on his way over. She called the cops, and my dad made the 15-minute drive in just under 5 minutes. When she opened the bedroom door to let my dad inside the house, the dogs took off running and barking through the house and downstairs to the basement. My sister ran screaming all the way through the house to the front door to let my dad in. He quickly took a look around the house with his gun, but did not see anything unusual. The police arrived a few minutes later and looked around the property. They found that the back gate was open, as well as the sliding glass door again, but not enough to let the dogs out. Just barely ajar, like it had been slammed shut and bounced back open a bit. They said it looked like someone had entered the home through the sliding glass door, because the lock was tampered with, but they determined that whoever it was hadn't stolen or disturbed anything. When my dad asked why someone would break in and not do anything, especially with the dogs locked up, the police said that they had been notified by the homeowners earlier that month that the husband received a death threat because of a decision that he made at his job that put a lot of people out of work. They had gone to the police about it, but didn't bother to tell my sister to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. Needless to say, we never dog sat for them again, and they moved out of state within a few months because the husband lost his job. And if you ask me, he deserved it.
I live in a town of about 11,000 in rural Wisconsin. Not by reference, but for a job. We are moving when I get a better one. I was on my way to my employer's house. He runs the company out of his basement until we get a new office space. I was being tailgated bad by a ratty blue car and a white bald guy. I drive a Kia Soul, which has a flat back end, so if I can't see your headlights, that means you're a mere few inches off my butt, and you will get me tapping my brakes. This guy did. He honked at me. Whatever. I flipped him off and slowed down to 5 miles under the speed limit. There wasn't anyone behind me, so I wasn't ruining anyone else's day. He had chances to pass me on the country road, but didn't. After a few minutes with no other cars around and him still kissing my bumper at 50 miles per hour, I grabbed my cell phone and pretended to turn around quickly and take a picture of him. Then I pretended to call 911. I was in the country with no other cars around, and this guy was getting creepy. I came to my turn, but decided to see if this guy would follow me. I turned left, and he followed. Then I came to a roundabout and thought I would lose him. I traveled the entire thing around twice, and he still followed me. At this point, I knew he was messing with me, trying to scare me. Well, I decided to let myself be late for my meeting. I began to drive to the police station. He followed me the whole way there. I pulled up and parked, ready to run inside. I thought he would leave. Nope. He parked right next to me and just stared at me, and he pulled up on my side of the car, close enough that I would have a hard time opening the door all the way. He was in his 40s, I'm guessing, wearing sunglasses and a creepy smile. He was wearing fairly neat clothes, nothing scary there. The interior of the car was pristine. I was anticipating to see a gun. I should mention here that I'm training to be a behavior analyst, and while I work with kids right now, my hobby is criminal behavior and profiling. I was seriously trying to read this guy. A few seconds went by and I grabbed my phone again, this time intent on calling 911 from the police station parking lot. As I dialed, he rolled his passenger window down, said nothing, rolled it back up, and took off. I went inside and told an officer what happened. Sadly, I was too focused on not crashing to get a plate number. Apparently, there had been a lot of complaints about tailgaters recently, multiple with a blue car. I filled out a report with the officer, and they gave me a card for victim services in a local woman's shelter, just in case he followed me home one night and I didn't feel safe, but I live in a secure building with my fiancé. I went out to my car, and there was a note on the windshield. All it had on it was a smiley face. Serious horror movie stuff there. I took it back inside. The officer said he'd call me a few times during the night, and I should avoid going anywhere alone for a while. He did call twice and said he was patrolling my parking lot during his night shift. This is a small town, and the attitude around here is very communal, so I feel safe that someone will back me up. If I ever see this guy again, no question, I will call 911 and lead him straight to the police station again. I also told my fiancé that I will post my work schedule, or even when I have to leave for another reason, and that if I don't text him within 10 minutes of my estimated arrival, to call 911. This happened like 16 years ago. I was 12 then. I was in the summer camp of my Boy Scout troop, but with both boys and girls. As are all in Spain, scouting here is actually a quite liberal thing. One of the most important activities during the summer camp is what we called the raid, basically going out of the camp to adventurously trek for a couple of days. My friends and I planned an amazing route through a beautiful mountain range called the Pyrenees in the northeast of Spain. 3 days walking, 2 nights sleeping out of the camp. My raid group consisted of 15 boys and girls, all between the ages of 12 and 14 years old. We took food with us, knew how to read a map, how to build shelter, how to search for water, and pretty much anything necessary to survive for a couple of days, so no adults were coming with us. And that doesn't happen anymore. Our plans for the first day were to climb a mountain that was just under 10,000 feet high and sleep by a glacial lake nearly on top of it. It was a long walk from our camp, about 15 miles and quite steep, so at about 1800 we decided we were going to not reach the lake at a prudent time. We found a nice place to build a shelter, did it, and then cooked some dinner. We were in the middle of a beautiful mountain, about 6 miles from the nearest road, and let's add another 5 kilometers more to the closest village. We couldn't have been happier. We still had nearly 2 hours until sunset when we finished our meal, so we thought it was a good idea to send a smaller group to clean dishes and refill water to a spring we had seen while walking. I volunteered to go, and 3 other friends joined. We got a couple of light torches too, just in case, and headed towards the fountain. Night came while we were on our way back to the shelter. We could hear the rest of the group singing and having fun in the distance. Suddenly one of my friends stopped and pointed at something just by the side of our trail. "This wasn't here on our way down. I'm sure of it," he said. There was a light reflecting pole from the road, torn into pieces. We went from being happy and relaxed to being mildly scared in just a second, and rushed all the way to where the rest of our friends were. We told them about our creepy finding right away. We were just kids, so fear escalated quite fast. Who could be hiding in the same mountain we were at? And why? Two of the older guys, they were 14 years old, thought it would be a good idea to go and take a look around to try to calm us down. Although being without them was even scarier, we also appreciated it. They went away with a light torch, a knife, and a whistle, so we could hear from further apart if they were in trouble. We remained seated inside the shelter, which was nothing more than a couple of tarps held by sticks near a big boulder, silent and scared. I remember hearing quite a lot of sobbing around me. I was thinking I didn't want to die there. One of the girls suggested that we could sing to try and think of something else. Some disapproved because we might not hear the whistles, but we did anyway, although not very loud. We were like that for about 10 to 20 minutes. The whistle interrupted our song. We heard it clearly. 2 whistles coming towards us at a really fast pace. I remember taking my knife from its sheath and keeping it in my hands. Luckily, it was our friends. They arrived nervous and exhausted from the run. They said they stumbled upon a long standing stick with lots of blood all over it, more than what our nerves could stand. Most of us started crying. Some prayed too. They told us they were going back to look for whatever was in the mountains with us and confront him. In case things go bad, we'll run somewhere else so he can't find you, one said. We asked them to stay, but nobody was able to move a finger to actually stop them from leaving. There was no more singing, only weeping and barely audible prayers. I just didn't want to die there. I wanted to see my family. After a while, we heard some noises, followed by the voices of our friends. They came back at a calm pace, with relief in their faces. It was all just a misunderstanding, one explained. It's just a park ranger. We found him and he explained to us that he was just walking around as part of his duty, said the other, and the bloody stick was just from a rabbit he had hunted for dinner. It was quite a relief, and we relaxed. Someone even spoke about taking out our sleeping bags and going to sleep, and that sounded wonderful. But it wasn't long until one of the older guys said he was a bit suspicious. You see, he wasn't wearing a uniform, he said, nor a badge or anything that could identify him as a ranger, answered another. And who walks kilometers away from the closest road, late at night, to hunt rabbits? Are there even rabbits in this altitude? Terror came back in a second. They were right. That story didn't make any sense. Let's go back there and freaking threaten him, one of the older guys said. We asked them to stay with us again and got the same results. Once they were gone, someone said that maybe he had followed them and now knew exactly where we were. We all shivered in panic. Nobody was paying the slightest attention to anyone else anymore. Nobody cried and nobody prayed. I remember I only had one thought in my mind. I'd rather kill than get killed in this terrible place. We waited seated, silent, and ready to fight for our lives. We all had our knives out and ready. Minutes passed, and suddenly we heard people running and approaching. We heard screams of terror. From the sound, it was obvious there were more than 2 people coming at us. I hadn't been more scared in my life. I hope I could say goodbye to my mom, my dad, and my sister. My knife was ready to stab whoever came close to me. We finally saw our 2 friends running for their lives, being followed by 2 men. They came just at the front of the opening of the shelter and stopped. The 2 men chasing them did the same, and we could see their faces. They were our camp leaders, who had been following us all the time, but hiding, and the 4 started laughing at us and asking if we were scared. It was just a joke, the entire time. Everyone started crying, and some even had trouble to grasp proper breaths due to anxiety for quite a while. We were all not amused. And only after a couple minutes, the funny 4 realized what they had done. They had taken 13 children to the point of holding a knife and being willing to kill with it. We obviously relaxed a lot, but our fears became anger. It had been a joke way out of proportion or the most basic of common sense. They spent quite a while saying how sorry they were, but we didn't care. We wanted them to leave us alone. But on the other hand, we were still too scared to sleep on our own, so we reluctantly accepted that they all came to sleep with us. It took them months to regain our trust again. It was the worst night of my life, no doubts. I've never had nightmares about it, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Now that I'm older, I always like to think of what would have happened if 2 guys had been there to kill us. We were children, sure, but armed and ready to defend ourselves if need be. I'm a journalist, so I can't help but think of some headlines. 2 murderers stabbed to death in the mountains by 13 children. Things were a lot different back then. And the scouts, has definitely changed for the better. When I was in my early 20s, I had a friend with a psychotic alcoholic father. She didn't live with him. He lived in a remote little coastal town. Now and again we would go together to visit him and stay the night. My relationship with him was creepy in itself, but that isn't the subject now. One night, when we were visiting, my friend and her dad had a drunken blow-up and kicked us out of the house. It was about midnight. We had gotten the lift down and didn't have a car. My friend's dad lived about 4 kilometers out of town, a huddle of 2 or 3 shops by way of a dirt road. We started walking down the dirt road to the town where there was a telephone booth. This was in the days before it was commonplace to have a mobile phone. I was going to call my folks, who lived about an hour and a half away, and see if they would come get us. The whole way to town, my friend was drunkenly moaning and crying about her broken relationship with her father, and she didn't let up by the time we got to the phone booth. We sat on a bench next to the phone while I woke my parents up. They agreed to come get us, and I sat down on the bench for the long wait. Shortly after this, a van appeared and parked just behind the bench we were sitting on, maybe 5 meters away. There were 2 young men in the front seats, and they were looking at us. If that didn't make me nervous enough, the van door slid open, and I saw there were a number of young guys in the back. I don't remember how many, more than 2. The place we were sitting was deserted. There were no houses nearby, just more road. No people, nowhere to run, no one driving by. It was a crappy little nowhere town. I stood up so I could see them better and kept my eyes fixed on the van full of men, acutely aware of our vulnerability. What I saw was that they were looking back at us. They were talking among themselves, quietly at first. Then they started talking more and more loudly. It became evident that they were deliberately talking loud enough for us to hear. They were talking about pulling us into the van and taking us somewhere to have their way with us and kill us. I can't remember the exact words, but that was the gist of it. My whole body was not shaking, but quaking with terror. I couldn't take my eyes off the men. I remember the face of one of them so clearly. I could draw it now. He was just sitting in the door of the van, looking at me with no expression, looking at me with dead eyes, looking at me like I was a thing. At this time, my drunk friend hadn't stopped sobbing to herself. Whether she knew the van was there at all, I couldn't say. I knew I had to tell her about the danger, but I was actually so full of terror I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. That was when the most incredible thing happened. My friend's father, who has never apologized to anyone in his life, appeared, drunk, in his car. It's hard to describe how unlikely it was for him to do this. He could hold a grudge like no one you've ever met, and he was such a stubborn mule. He and my friend had an emotional reunion. The whole time my eyes were fixed on the van. The men had stopped talking and were just watching us. "Let's go," I said. We got in the car and started heading for my friend's dad's house. The van started up and began to follow us. I tried to explain to my friend's dad about the men, but he said, "I'll just slow down and they can pass." They slowed to a crawl behind us, and then they began to shout out of the windows, screaming threats. They followed us all the way down the dirt road, and then all the way down the driveway of my friend's dad's house. They just sat in the van behind us, and we sat in the car waiting to see what would happen. All of my friend's dad's neighbors were holiday homes, and nobody was in that night. We knew that if the group of men decided to get out of the van and carry out those threats, we would get no help. After a very long time, the van backed out of the driveway, and they left. My parents came in a panic to the house when they couldn't find us at the shops. My friend's dad hid in shame, and I went back to my family's house. I've been asked if I went to the police, but I can't remember. I don't think I did. It was a messed up time in my life, but that incident changed me forever. I'm a very fearful person now, and very overprotective of my kids, and I don't want to change because I'd rather be like this than accidentally trust one of the millions of psychos out there.
In 2014, after hearing all of the horror stories, I wanted to check the deep web out myself. In a way, I kind of expected nothing other than scam sites for assassins, people requesting CP, and some underground markets. However, I prepared myself for the worst and, frankly, I was more worried about getting in trouble with the authorities rather than having my mind bleached for the near future. Even after 2 to 3 hours of procrastination, nothing prepared me for what I saw. It was during the middle of the day when I began my search. Of course, there's no deep web Google or anything, but rather a wiki with a lot of links. The links are different than the links you may know of. These links have no way of knowing what lays behind them. Just numbers and a .onion at the end. Of course, unless previously defined and listed on the wiki page. It was boring at first. A lot of dead sites, more than expected eBay-style markets for weapons, military grade mind you, various services, and of course a lot of drugs. I came across a chat room where I saw a darker side of people I never thought was possible. So many people that were mentally ill, threatening others, requesting CP. It was truly disgusting. Think of the people who walk down dark streets of a bad neighborhood, but with anything they desired at their fingertips. 2 hours later, I came across one site that ended my little adventure in the wastes of human consciousness. A cult site, perhaps, with little info other than an email address and some religious mumbo-jumbo. However, there was a video embedded in the site's homepage. Like a naive child, I clicked it without a care in the world. The video was shot on a crappy video camera. Perhaps it was shot in the early to mid-2000s. It was a man with a mask and a knife. As quickly as that scene showed up, another presented itself. He was cutting something in a similar fashion to a butcher. It was then and there I realized the body was bipedal and without fur. It was a human being. He was cutting the legs at the buttocks level. A new scene shows the decapitation of the head. Then another shot of the man with the mask, followed by a picture of a church with a weird symbol. This was a cult recruiting website. It was followed by more bodies being cut up and hung in ways more gruesome than you may expect. Shortly after, I turned my computer off, and I stayed away from it for quite some time. This was my first and last visit to the deep web. I have never contemplated going back since.
Number 3. This was back before Google. Web pages were, for the most part, still very basic HTML and JavaScript. Hardly anyone used CSS. Only discussion boards and some banking sites had anything approaching mature front-end, back-end combinations. This is a real deep web story, not just one about illicit activities online. I was browsing random blogs, GeoCity sites and the like, just going from link to link. Eventually I came upon an odd page. It appeared to be random thoughts from different people, but for the time it was very well designed. Eventually I came upon an odd page. It appeared to be random thoughts from different people, but for the time it was very well designed. The messages seemed to be cryptic in nature, like several people trying to pass secret notes. I started through the source, and hidden in the comments of a JavaScript were various IP addresses. I gathered all the IPs in a text file and began enumerating. Some were routers with banner messages I could telnet to, almost all at universities. The default Cisco credentials from back in the day worked on most of them, but I didn't poke around. A few of the IPs were web servers with little to nothing on them, mostly APAC on Linux or some BSD, at least one IIS server I can recall. I finally came upon a web server with a huge directory of HTML files and TIFF images, with a few smaller subdirectories containing the same. NSLOOKUP returned no reverse records for the IP. A visual route traced it as far as Colorado. The HTML files appeared to be records a psychologist or similar mental health professional would keep. The images were of faxes, apparently of both military and medical nature. As I browsed from a subdirectory back to the parent, at the top was a new HTML file named something like 1-hello there.html. The timestamp was from right that minute. I opened it, and in plain text was the message, "We see you." No quotes, all lowercase. About 15 seconds later, the server dropped.
I didn't have a great childhood. I'm not one to complain about it. My parents did the best they could, but we ended up living in some pretty terrible places with not so nice families. Then right around the time I started secondary school, the kids I was hanging out with at the time started smoking cigarettes. Yeah, they were like 11 or 12 and they were smoking. Not just taking performative puffs on sticks either, I mean full-on smoking like troopers. And being the divvy that I am, I joined them on more than one occasion, and they basically taught me to smoke out by this old World War II pillbox. Then one time, we all go out to the pillbox and this kid gives us all a ciggy from the pack he'd stolen from his mom. I thought he was being a bit generous, but I wasn't one to complain. I just didn't think I could finish off a whole cigarette on my own, since just a few drags on one had me feeling pretty woozy the previous few times. But I figured, a few tokes, I can peg it out, smoke the rest of it later. The next thing that had me kind of suspicious was how weirdly loose the cigarette seemed, almost like it had been tampered with somehow. Now, I know, huge alarm bells are going off in the head of every right-minded person listening, but honestly, at like 11 years old, I couldn't even imagine what it might have been tampered with. I was really naive. I didn't know what hash or Mary were. I didn't know about anything other than ciggies and beers. So I'm looking at this ciggy and then I look up at the lad who gave it to me and I remember asking, Have you done anything to this ciggy? He says no. I say okay, then light up and start puffing. Immediately I start coughing, but my friend reassures me that it's just the last one in the pack. I'll never forget that. He said it like it was totally normal to have one loose, scrabby ciggy in the pack, like it was tradition or something. So I tried a few more puffs, but started coughing again. So I gave up on trying to smoke it, tossed it away, then asked for some of my friends. I know something was definitely going on when he seemed annoyed that I'd thrown away my ciggy, and just when I was trying to work out what he might have done to it, I started feeling very, very funny indeed. Everything started to tingle. My eyes felt all puffy and my vision started to Ferris wheel, with each eye going in the opposite direction. I tried to talk, but words just wouldn't come out and my tongue felt like it was swelling up in my mouth, and suddenly I just got so thirsty I could barely think about anything else. Then no matter how many deep breaths I took, I just couldn't seem to get enough air, and suddenly I found myself lying in the grass. Like I literally couldn't walk. I had no idea what was going on, and when I started begging my friends to help me, they looked terrified and just ran away like I was dying or something. I can't stress this enough. I really did think I was about to die, even when my dad rushed onto the scene to take me back home. My so-called friends had been decent enough to run and get them, but all they said is, Pete's feeling sick and Pete fell down. Just a vague idea of what was actually going on. So, my dad's scared and I'm so terrified I'm just in tears. When he picks me up, goes to run off and stops. I remember how he sniffed my clothes and hair all studiously for a moment, and I almost started to get aggressive with him because I remember I was so frustrated that we stopped moving. It was a weird experience because I felt like I was in some strange euphoric dream state, and I really felt like if we stopped, I was going to get very angry. It was such a weird experience. And it was at that moment that he rushed me to the hospital. And it was the subsequent time that I spent in the ER that my parents found out and later revealed to me that the kid had actually dipped the cigarette in some sort of formaldehyde embalming fluid and essentially given me some form of PCP, which for those that don't know, in some instances can make someone act with schizophrenic-like side effects. My parents said the doctor said I was really lucky that I didn't continue to smoke, as it may have had even more serious side effects, even though, as time went on, I still felt very on edge in my time at the hospital and after the time I got out. My dad told me it freaked my mom out so much that all she wanted to know was how a kid my age had gotten his hands on that stuff, and I was forced to tell them about my friend, in which case the police visited his house, forcing his hand to reveal that he'd seen his younger uncle that lived with him using that stuff prior.
I don't know what became of that kid and his family, as I'm not sure if my parents had continued to press charges or how everything with them actually transpired. But the whole thing had just been apparently one horrible prank in the kid's mind. And although I'm not entirely sure if it was out of malice or some spirit of experimentation, that little prank amounted to one of the scariest memories of my entire childhood. I grew up in the super middle class area of my hometown, all townhouses and nice restaurants, but it bordered some really rough neighborhoods. All thanks to the school zoning, a lot of my high school friends lived in the nearby projects, so I'd go over there to hang out after school and on weekends. We had our little group of friends, but we were familiar and friendly with a few of the other crews that were into some considerably naughtier things than us. For example, there was this guy, Mike, and although we didn't hang out much, we always stopped to say hi to him and his boys if we ever saw them in the streets. But like I said, we rarely hung out with them because, for fun, they liked to steal cars. It might sound crazy when I say it wasn't malicious, but it's kinda true. Mike and his crew would steal a car, burn rubber for a while, then park it right back where they had found it before the owner even knew it was gone. I remember one time hearing about how they felt so guilty about stealing one lady's car that they parked it up where they found it, but not before they topped off the gas tank to replace what they burned. They were crazy like that, but they weren't bad guys, and besides, we were just dumb teenagers at the time, so we thought that it was just cool to do. Anyways, it's summer break after our freshman year of high school, and me and my boys are just wandering around, acting like fools, but otherwise keeping out of trouble. I remember one of us had managed to use the fluff of his top lip to trick some old gas station attendant into selling him a pack of Marlboro, so we were headed down to this piece of scrubland we knew about to smoke up. About 5 minutes away, we started smelling smoke from somewhere, but black smoke. So we're all like, uh-oh, whose apartment is on fire? But we keep walking, seeing nowhere on fire, so we just get more and more curious as to where the fire's coming from. Then, we see two of Mike's boys just tearing it across some yards, sprinting as fast as their little legs could carry them. We shout over to them, and although they look over, they don't stop. They don't look happy to see us like they usually would. They just keep running. So immediately we're like, oh God, what hood rat stuff have they been up to? And it wasn't long before we put two and two together and figured out that the fire might well be something they did. Then right as we get to the desolate plot of land we'd been planning on going to, we see it. Just this ball of flames under a brick wall. Then when we get closer, we realize the fireball is actually a burning car. We were pretty shocked. I'd never heard of them doing anything like that before. It was always illegal but relatively harmless fun. Why set a car on fire when they could have just returned it like they normally did? You think they crashed it? I remember someone asking, but no one could be sure. We just waited and watched as the fire department showed up to put out the fire, closely followed by the cops. I remember we thought about running, but how it was pointless. It'd just make us look guilty. Eventually, when the fire was out, the cops walked over and we just front as best we can, tell them we don't know anything about the car or those that set it on fire. I think the cop knew we were lying. I suppose you just get good at picking up on them when you hear so many, because he just acted like we were withholding information, telling us that we'd be in a lot of trouble if we were protecting the guilty party. And we just shrug it off. It wasn't like it was the first time we lied to the cops. It wasn't even the first time we'd lied for Mike and his crew. But then out of nowhere, the other cop comes over to see how it's going, and his partner's like, these kids know something all right. They're just tight-lipped. Then when the other guy responded, our response told them all they needed to know. Don't want to snitch, huh? The other cop said. Well, as long as they can sleep at night, because whoever's kid is burnt to a crisp in that thing isn't going to be sleeping for quite a while. I remember the sinking feeling I felt in that moment, how the color must have drained from my face because I could feel it leave my face. One of Mike's boys had been in that car when it caught fire. The other two just ran when they found that they couldn't pull him out. Then get this. We came to find out that the kid who burned to death in the car was Mike himself. He'd been the driver, and the front end of the car had basically pancaked when he'd apparently deliberately crashed it into a wall. What he did that for, I don't know. Maybe he was high or something, but either way, his legs got trapped. The car caught fire, and he burned to death. I guess his boys were just so scared and shook up that they just ran. And Jesus, thinking about it later, I realized that if he was conscious when they were trying to free him, and he started burning before he passed out from the smoke, those guys would have heard him screaming as he burned. It was a whole thing, man, all up in the news for weeks after. Mike's boys turned themselves in after a while, and I think they were so messed up that they just couldn't live with themselves. Ended up getting suspended sentences when they spilled their guts about how Mike was driving and how he was acting crazy. I don't know how true that is. I mean, it sounds true, but I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to say how Mike didn't deserve to die like that. And if I had to label one memory from my childhood as being the worst or most traumatic, it was watching that car burn, not knowing one of our friends was burning in it. September 2010. My boyfriend Dave, his best friend Tony, and my best friend Liz and I were all coming back to our hometown for our final year of college after spending the summer in London. We had a fantastic time, staying in my uncle's apartment, partying, and exploring such a big city. It was great. We stopped at a bed and breakfast that night about half of the way home, and were planning to get home at about 6 p.m. We all woke up early, about 4, maybe 5, ready to set off again, when we discovered that someone had obviously driven too close to our car and broke the right wing mirror off. Seeing as this was my dad's birthday present to me, and I had it barely 2 months, I was absolutely fuming. We asked the landlady where we could possibly find spares or something to use for the time being. She said she had driven past a makeshift scrapyard or something a while back. She wasn't sure if it was still there, but she drew us a rough map, and we got back on the road. I wasn't very sure if she was right about her directions because the closer we got to the area she circled it in, the more desolate the surroundings were. The roads got more difficult and had gone from stone to dirt. Around us there weren't any farms anymore, just long, weedy grass and patches of forest. It had basically become a moor. We were about to head off because of the wild animals, and I just have to get over being a paranoid driver and deal without my wing mirror, when surely enough my boyfriend pointed out in front to a handwritten sign directing us 2 miles down the road to Cafe and Car Spares. We drove down into a little cove surrounded by forest and all got out, except for my friend Liz, who was asleep in the back seat. There was a tiny cream hut with cafe spray painted on the roof, a caravan, and a hill of metal and bits of cars. As to be expected, we were the only visitors parked up in front. The sun was up, but no lights or people were around. I guess they were still sleeping. It was still about 6 anyway. We all walked up to the scrap pile, and I had to fumble through it, looking for a wing mirror or any sort of mirror that could do for the time being until I could get it repaired. Tony picked up what could only be at least a decade-old mirror and suggested we just take it and go. But me, being stupid and sincere, insisted I have to go give them some money for it. I can't just take it and go. I knocked on the door and waited. A big, hard-faced man answered the door and at first looked angry and tired, then smiled at me a two-toothed smile. He leered at me for a few seconds, then, seeing the boys approach, asked us what we wanted. Tony handed him the mirror and asked how much for it. He said nothing, just to get to know us, to which I thought fair enough. 2 more men then left the patio door on the other side. They turned and smiled, both skinheads with teeth like meth addicts, and came over. They stank. He gave them the mirror and told them to go attach it to our car. He then introduced himself as Ian, sat us down on the patio chairs, and offered us some sandwiches. I politely declined, but he insisted we must be hungry, and told me to come in, that women are best at making sandwiches. I declined again, finding him a little bit sexist at this point, and when he asked again, Dave more sternly reinforced that I said I don't want to come in. Ian muttered something and then came and sat on the chairs with us. It became awkward very quickly as he started asking questions. It started off innocently, like asking us how old we were, where we were from, and then became a little more uncomfortable. He asked if I had a boyfriend, to which Dave answered, and then started asking us both what we liked to do to each other. Private stuff like that, to which we didn't answer. We sat in silence until we heard Liz scream. When we turned around, I saw one of the men meant to be fixing the mirror with his hand in the back window grasping Liz's leg. The other was looking around nervously behind the car. We got up immediately and sprinted off the patio, Tony running after the guys, but they both headed into the forest. Liz was hysterical. She'd woken up to find herself on her own in the car and a man's hand running up her leg. I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have felt. I got into the back seat with her and consoled her while Dave came around the other side to get in and told us some nails were on the floor. We looked over and there were about 12 of them arranged around the tire, like the guy was ready to pop them. I couldn't really think why at the time, but now I wonder where they got all those car parts. We decided it was enough. We didn't want to spend any more time there, mirror or no mirror, and were ready to go when Tony was the last to get in the car. He closed the back seat door, and as we looked back and saw Ian re-emerge from the house with something long in his hands, running towards us, my vision adjusted when he got a bit closer, and then I realized he was holding a rifle, a hunting rifle. At that point, I actually burst into tears and hit the engine, slamming on the accelerator as hard as possible. The car started to go, and we got up to about 90, forgetting the dirt roads and just driving over whatever until that scrapyard was out of sight. We didn't stop looking behind us until we were safely on the motorway getting home. To this day, whenever I go to London, I take a train instead. I'm still terrified I'll meet them again. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you would do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. I was told it covered roughly the same landmass as the state of Maryland, USA, about 9 hours from Sydney City, and the property itself was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. In short, it was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city. Our boss was a guy called Jeremy who owned the farm and supervised us while helping out with the work. He was pretty laid back and was generally really good to us. This summer in particular was very hot and the work was hard. So one day when the temperature hit about 38 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on the farm about a 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the afternoon, so him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. "Do you see that over there, beneath the 2 dead trees?" I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red and mostly flat and bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer, we realized it was a huge blue shipping container just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed, and I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously didn't. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area about 5 weeks before, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property, but in truth, I was really anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a big diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated so they buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, with all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go. He brushed me off, however, reminded me it was his farm, and whoever had put this here was trespassing, so he wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. He had bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was the rush of cold air as we got in. The place was air-conditioned, which I must admit was quite pleasant on such a hot day. We searched around for a light switch, but I could already see this was some sort of IT setup. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and the sort of hum you hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered, office setup. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3 high, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, and several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. This made absolutely no sense. We wandered to the middle and sat down at the desk to see if the computers could give us any idea of what was going on here. My heart was racing, and I just wanted to bolt. We had been seen by CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from my lay position is that it was endless lists of computer talk. It was like how the old Napster or LimeWire download screens look like, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container to the big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided, against my better judgment, to see what was inside all these boxes. My brief sift through this box still makes me feel sick to my stomach. It didn't take me long to realize that this box was full of posters, DVDs, and photos, all of explicit and hardcore child X-rated material. One thing that still gets to me is that it was all neatly ordered into folders and small boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up, and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I said something to the effect of, "Mate, get out. Dude, child, what? Just get out of here, dude." I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception. We hadn't bought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. As I mentioned, very remote. We waited, talking frantically about what we'd seen, until the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives, and we jumped in and led them back. This is where it gets worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open, and there was fire inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the cars, and they did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, which, by that stage, most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off the property, and the landmass was huge, and there was no real way to tail them. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by that time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still there on the farm, as it's too expensive to move. I'll never forget what I saw in those boxes.
Snapchat was still pretty new when this story took place. It was sometime in late 2011. During my freshman year of high school, I had one really close friend. Her name was Samantha. Samantha told me one Friday before the weekend that she would ask for a friend request the next day. She thought it would be really cool if we bandwagoned on the Snapchat trend. The sooner the better, because Snapchat was almost non-existent at our school. And when I got home that day, I got a friend request. The profile picture was of Samantha. This was odd because she told me that she would invite me to her contacts the next day. Without hesitating, I accepted it. I figured she just got to it sooner. After I finished my homework the same day, I got a message from that account. 2 messages, in fact. They said, "Come to my house tomorrow, we can have a party." And the second was her address. I was really happy as I never went to her house before. We had just met earlier that year. And besides that, I wasn't often invited to parties. The address she gave me was to a house nearby, so I decided to walk over the next day. When I actually saw the house, I checked Google Maps multiple times to make sure I was led to the right destination. Because this place was very messy, and the windows were covered in those thank you bags you get at markets. Something didn't seem right. It was very modest for Samantha's family, yet we attended a private school. I realized the address was correct, so I knocked on the door, although I was a bit hesitant. It opened very quickly, and a man greeted me, almost like he was expecting me. He was about 6'3" with blonde hair. He really didn't look anything like Samantha, who was a short, black-haired girl. I asked if they were related. He simply said, "Yes." It was in a very plain and odd voice. Then I asked him about the bags on the windows, and he said it was because construction workers were still renovating the house. Before I could ask or say anything else, he beckoned me inside, moving aside so I could go through the doorway. I entered the small house. Sitting near a frayed couch was a large terrier, which he said they just bought a few days before I arrived. He told me to sit down while he went to get something. I checked the time on my phone, but the moment I grabbed it, it vibrated with a message. It was a notification from Snapchat. It was Samantha. It said, "Here is my Snapchat." And I thought things couldn't get weirder. She'd already sent me a request. Did she make another profile? Why would she do that? So immediately, as confused as I was, I messaged her back. "Your house is so weird. Where are you?" I said. "House?" she asked. "I have an apartment." My heart sank in my chest. Surely she was pulling my leg, just making a joke on me or something, I thought. "That's not funny," I messaged back. "Your dad's home. Where are you?" She didn't answer for a few seconds. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got an answer. An answer that confirmed everything. "What are you talking about?" it said. "My mom's been single for a while. I'm waiting for you by the door. Where are you?" I lower my phone, eyes wide and breathing funny. What do I do? Did I really just walk into a stranger's house? A stranger that had laid bait for me? That's when I hear whispering from another room. The man stepped out of the room with 2 other men. One was holding a thick black bag with his hands. Fully assuming the worst, I sprinted out of the house as fast as I could. Not once did I look back, even as I heard the footsteps behind me. Eventually, they faded away. I didn't stop running until I got back home, until I was inside the house with the doors locked. Once I finally got a breather, my chest never burned so bad before. My mom and dad looked worried when they saw me, and they needed an explanation. In between breaths, I tried to tell them. They got the gist of it, and they called the police. When the police got there, they were gone. That house had been abandoned. There should have been no one living there.
3 weeks ago, someone added me on Snapchat called Addergreen. I thought nothing of it at first, but Then a few days later, I got a bus to the gym since I couldn't be bothered to walk. It's 4 miles away, so it's alright to take the bus. Sitting at the front with my headphones in, listening to music to make the journey that less bit boring. From the bus stop to the gym, I was messing around on my phone when I noticed I had a Snapchat from Adder Green. It was only on for a few seconds, but the Snapchat was a picture of me sitting on the bus. No text, just me. It was taken from a few seats behind and shown the back of my head and some of my hoodie. I instantly knew it was me, and I felt my stomach drop. I bombarded them with Snapchats. They were opening my Snapchats, but not responding. They got more aggressive because I was getting more and more pissed off. For example, "Who is this? Who are you? Answer me. For fuck's sake, just reply." You get the drift. After about a week, I got nothing, so gave up and thought one of my friends was being a dick. Then Snapchat number 2. Didn't screenshot this one either. I know I'm a moron, but I was drunk. Me and some mates were in a club in my local town, and this time someone Snapchatted to me a photo of myself at the bar. They were literally standing right next to me at the bar. I opened it the next morning and felt sick. Again, it was only for a few seconds. My friends were next to me in the photo, so that eliminated the possibility of it being one of them fucking with me. About 30 minutes ago, I got another Snapchat. This time I was ready and sober enough to take a screenshot. I've been indoors all day. I was curious what it was. That is my house, my bedroom window, and my name. I received this as I was lying next to my window on my bed watching Game of Thrones. I feel sick. Their Snapchat stories are equally as fucked up. Update number 1. I sent them a snap saying, "Are you fucking serious?" And they screenshotted it and ignored me. Update number 2. Got another brick wall Snapchat, only on for literally a second though. Update number 3. Fuck. Lying in bed watching Game of Thrones and I just got this. I'm fucking done. Update number 4. Today I got a Snapchat of that brick wall again. Update number 5. Just got a Snapchat video of weird as fuck noises and a black screen. It's in their stories too. Don't think I can post Snapchat videos though. Update number 6. It's been quiet for a few days. Sent Addergreen Snapchats, but they're unopened. Who is this shithead? And what does he want with me?
This happened last year when I was 14. There's this dating app for teenagers. I used it as more of a joke. It was connected to Snapchat, so whenever you matched with someone, you would add them to Snapchat so you could continue talking to your match. As I said, at first I was using it as a joke, but then I matched with this really good-looking guy, and I thought, well, would it hurt to try? So I accepted his request to be my friend on Snapchat. I sent a shy hi to him and waited for a response. It took him about 2 hours to respond, and the only thing he sent was a blank black picture. I didn't think too much of it, and I continued on with my day. But the next day I get a message from him, a picture of a very familiar thing. My school. It was only a little jarring, but I figured he probably went to the same school and we had just never met. Then my phone began to vibrate like crazy during a class. To give a little perspective, we have glass doors and windows. They look out into the corridors during class, and when I checked my phone, I saw maybe 15 pictures sent to me from the same guy. They were pictures of me sitting at my desk in the classroom. The pictures kept coming. They seemed to have been taken from outside that window next to the door. When I looked over, I saw someone standing there, just outside that window. He had a phone in his hand, and he was pointing at me. Whoever it was wearing a black hoodie. The hood covered half of his face, and the other half was pale, and he had a sharp jawline. I could see thin lips curved into a grin. And I saw my friend. She was looking at him too, and her face turned red, and she began to shake. We were the only ones who saw them, because as fast as we tried to say something, the figure was gone. My friend stood up from her chair and went to the door to open it. It caught my teacher's attention, and we had to explain what we were doing. We had to tell them what we saw. My teacher went out herself to look for whoever this was, and then she even told the office. They let out a message over the speakers, telling everyone to look out for this man. Ever since then, I haven't used Snapchat. It was one of the apps I used all the time before. It still creeps me out, though it may have been a joke and it must have been someone who knew me from before, but it was still horrifying. It had made me a lot more paranoid about strangers on the internet.